It's the summer of 1942. Hitler leans over his war maps, eyes blazing with ambition and obsession, pointing to the oil-rich lands of the Caucasus. He believes this campaign will secure the lifeblood of his war machine, crush the Soviet Union once and for all, and cement his vision of unstoppable power. German tanks roar across endless steppes, infantry marches through dust and smoke, and cities burn under the relentless thunder of artillery. Entire armies trained for conquest are moving forward with precision, but what they do not yet see is the trap closing around them. One bold gamble for oil and dominance will soon spiral into chaos, turning triumph into desperation. Stalingrad awaits, the city that will become a frozen tomb of fire, blood, and unimaginable human suffering. Operation Blue is no longer just a plan. It is a crucible of strategy, endurance, and the devastating consequences of ambition. This is the untold story of the Nazi push into the heart of Russia. A campaign of audacious tactics, blinding ambition, and the forces that would change the course of World War E forever. If this dive into the incredible story of Operation Blue is gripping your imagination, go ahead and hit that like button. It really shows your support and helps keep these stories alive. And if you haven't already, subscribe so you can join us on more journeys through the most dramatic moments in history. I'd love to know what you think. Drop a comment below sharing your thoughts on Hitler's bold gamble, the push towards Stalingrad, or any moment in this campaign that surprised you the most. Now, let's begin. Chapter 1. The Summer of Ambition. Hitler's vision for the 1942 Eastern Campaign. The summer of 1942 opened over the Eastern Front like a mirage shimmering above endless plains. The bitter snows of the previous winter had melted into black mud and then dried into a dusty carpet of steppe grass stretching beyond the horizon. For Hitler and his generals, this was not simply another season of war, but a chance to undo the humiliation of their first great setback. Operation Barbarossa had promised a lightning strike to crush the Soviet Union in a single campaign. Instead, it had bogged down before Moscow, leaving hundreds of thousands of frozen soldiers and shattered panzers littering a landscape they had believed would be conquered by Christmas. Now, with the Reich at the height of its territorial expansion, Hitler's imagination reached further south toward the oil fields of the Caucasus, toward the lifeblood of modern warfare. Without that oil, Germany's war machine could not run. With it, Hitler believed he could secure his empire for generations. As he looked over the maps at his headquarters in Reisenberg, he saw not just terrain, but destiny. Rivers, railways, and refineries ranged like stepping stones to victory. Yet, the picture was far more complex than a glance at the map suggested. German forces were stretched thin across a front longer than all of Europe's pre-war borders combined. Soviet resistance had not collapsed but hardened. Learning with each defeat how to adapt to the Wehrmachter's tactics, the Red Army had replenished its ranks with new divisions, and its factories east of the Urals, once threatened by German advance, were now outproducing much of the German war industry. Still, Hitler believed he had time, that one decisive push in the south could deliver a blow from which Stalin could not recover. His generals, many of them seasoned veterans of 1941's campaign, voiced concerns quietly. The army needed rest, supplies, and a coherent plan, but Hitler's will dominate it all. He issued Führer Directive No. 41 outlining a new offensive he called Full Blow Case Blue. Its goal was nothing less than the seizure of the entire southern wing of the Soviet Union, from the bend of the Don River to the oil-rich Caucasus Mountains. In his mind, the war of annihilation begun with Barbarossa had not changed course, but entered a new phase. Moscow, he reasoned, was a political objective. Oil was a material one. Without the oil, Stalin could not fuel his tanks or planes. Without the grain of the Cuban and the mineral wealth of the Donets Basin, the Soviet state might wither. The Wehrmacht, however, had been bled by the previous winter's fighting. Entire divisions were under strength. Supplies of fuel, trucks, and spare parts were perilously low. Even as Hitler demanded new armored thrusts, his army was still moving on a single rail line feeding into the south. Vulnerable to partisans and overstretched to the breaking point, This tension between Hitler's ambition and his army's capacity would define Case Blue. From its inception, to the soldiers gathering on the steppe, the new offensive seemed at first a promise of redemption. The Luftwaffe repaired its airfields, panzer divisions assembled at the jump-off points, and propaganda painted the operation as the blow that would bring the Bolshevik giant to its knees. Officers briefed their men about the fertile lands ahead, the supposed welcome of anti-Sede populations, and the rich resources that would flow to the Reich. Many believed it. After all, 1941 had seen victories of unprecedented scale, even if incomplete. Surely this time the lessons had been learned. Surely the Russians would not rise again. Yet in dugouts and field kitchens, the veterans remembered the snow, the counter-offensives, the long marches with empty fuel tanks, and they wondered. Meanwhile, Stalin and his staff, the Soviet High Command, watched and waited. They too had maps, and their intelligence reported a massive build-up in the south. Factories produced new T-34 tanks and Yak fighters. New armies were forming behind the lines. In the months ahead, the Soviet Union would fight not merely to hold territory, but to lure the invader into overextension, a strategy that was beginning to take shape even as Hitler planned his grand assault. Thus, as the summer sun rose higher, two visions of the coming campaigns stared at each other across hundreds of miles of steppe, one of rapid conquest, the other of deliberate attrition. The tension between these visions would shape one of the most dramatic and consequential campaigns of the Second World War. This first movement of the story of Case Blue is not just about armies, but about hubris and necessity colliding. It is the story of a Reich that had tasted the possibility of limitless conquest, and now risked everything to secure the material means to continue fighting a world at war. In the quiet before the offensive began, German staff officers scribbled timetables of advances measured in days and killem. But war on the Eastern Front had a way of devouring timetables, just as it had devoured so many divisions before. When the panzers rolled forward once more in June 1942, they carried with them not only steel and fuel, but also the hopes of a regime convinced that one more push could win the East, and the seeds of its own undoing. In the weeks leading up to the launch of Case Blue, Hitler retreated deeper into his own certainties. At his headquarters, the Wolf's Lair, he studied endless charts of rivers and railway junctions. Convinced that his instincts surpassed the caution of his generals, he saw the vast sweep of southern Russia not as a quagmire, but as an open highway leading directly to the Caucasus. Oil production at Make-up Grozny, and eventually Baku shimmered in his imagination, like a black ocean ready to fill German barrels. He even dreamed of pushing into the Middle East after the Caucasus fell, linking hands with Rommel's Afrika Korps and cutting off Britain from its empire. For Hitler, Case Blue was more than an operation. It was the pivot of the entire war. Success here could the Soviet Union force Stalin to the negotiating table, and free Germany to confront its Western enemies at leisure. But the reality beneath the maps was less cooperative. By May 1942, the Wehrmacht had rebuilt much of its striking power, but remained fragile. More than 1.44 million men were allocated to army groups south, supported by thousands of tanks, assault guns, and aircraft. Yet many formations were worn thin. Panzer divisions that had entered Russia in 1941 with over 200 tanks sometimes had fewer than 80 serviceable vehicles. The Luftwaffe, though still formidable, had suffered losses it could not easily replace. Supply lines from Germany to the front stretched across bomb-damaged railways, and roads choked with horse-drawn wagons. Even ammunition and food stocks were calculated in weeks rather than months. The offensive success depended on a rapid advance. Any delay risked starving the spearheads of fuel and shells. Hitler's command style exacerbated these vulnerabilities. No longer content to issue broad objectives, he increasingly dictated operational details, moving divisions on his personal whim and reshuffling objectives midstream. The generals who had once maneuvered with flexibility now found themselves bound to rigid timets, yet few dared challenge him openly. Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, appointed to lead Army Group South, tried to caution the Führer about the scale of the objectives, but his protests were brushed aside. Halder, the Army's Chief of Staff, recorded in his diary the surreal atmosphere at headquarters. Hitler, convinced of his own genius, outlining simultaneous drives on Stalingrad and the Caucasus as though logistics and enemy resistance were trivial obstacles. On the Soviet side, Stalin's intelligence services reported these preparations with growing alarm. German deception efforts, though elaborate, could not hide the massing of armor and aircraft in the south. The Staffer debated where the blow would fall. Many assumed the Germans would renew their drive on Moscow, the symbolic heart of Soviet power. Others, noting the concentration of forces on the southern flank, suspected a push toward the Don and the Caucasus. In either case, Stalin ordered new defensive lines built, scorched earth measures prepared, and mobile reserves positioned to strike at any overextended German advance. Unlike in 1941, the Red Army now had experience and depth. It could trade space for time, bleeding the invader as he reached for his goals. Meanwhile, on the ground, the atmosphere among the troops was one of tense expectation. Letters from German soldiers show a mixture of hope and foreboding. Some wrote of finally ending the Russian campaign, imagining parades and home leave after victory. Others recalling the winter debacle, worried about how far they would be ordered to go. As spring gave way to early summer, the steppe filled with dust clouds raised by tanks and trucks moving to assembly areas. Villages along the rail lines swarmed with columns of men and equipment, their insignia repainted, their orders sealed. The scale was immense, an army preparing not merely for another offensive, but for what Hitler saw as the decisive stroke of the entire Eastern War. When Case Blue began on June 28, 1942, it erupted with a thunder that seemed to vindicate Hitler's vision. The Luftwaffe unleashed waves of bombers to clear the skies and shatter Soviet positions. Artillery and rocket launchers pounded the Red Army's defenses. Then the panzers rolled forward, engines roaring, dust rising in choking clouds. At first, the Soviet lines cracked and retreated, prisoners streaming to the rear, villages falling in rapid succession. German communiques announced victory after victory, the familiar language of encirclement and annihilation returning to the headlines in Berlin and across occupied Europe. The propaganda machine trumpeted the advance as proof that the Reich had regained its momentum. Even among the troops, there was a surge of confidence. This, they thought, is how it was meant to be. Yet beneath the surface, the seeds of future disaster were already sprouting. The distances in the south dwarfed those of the previous year. Railheads lagged far behind the advancing spearheads. Fuel trucks raced to keep up, but often arrived late or empty. Soviet resistance, though forced back, stiffened at key points, delaying the timetable. And crucially, Hitler's decision to split Army Group South into two separate formations, one driving towards Stalingrad, the other into the Caucasus, would soon stretch his forces past the point of cohesion. What began as a vision of swift conquest was turning almost imperceptibly at first into a gamble whose stakes were the fate of the German army on the Eastern Front. That I end this opening chapter of Case Blue. The story is less about battles than about a vast machine in motion, propelled by ambition and necessity. It is the moment before a great leap, when everything seems possible and the danger still distant. But history, like the Russian steppe, offers no shortcuts. The Wehrmacht was stepping into an arena, larger than its maps could capture, against an enemy learning faster than anyone in Berlin suspected. And as the sun of 1940 climbed high over the Don, the march toward oil, the Volga, and ultimately Stalingrad had begun, carrying within it both the promise of triumph and the shadow of catastrophe. Chapter 2. From Barbarossa to Blue, Lessons Learned and Plans Rewritten. The ghosts of 1941 still haunted every corridor of the German High Command. Operation Barbarossa had begun with a roar and ended in the bitter snows outside Moscow, and that experience weighed on the minds of planners as they sat down to design Case Blue. The summer and autumn of 1941 had seen entire Soviet armies vanish in encirclements, hundreds of thousands of prisoners marched west, and seemingly limitless space conquered in a matter of weeks. But the deeper the Wehrmacht drove into Russia, the more it discovered a landscape that devoured its logistics and an enemy who learned with every defeat. By December, when Stalin launched his counter-offensive before Moscow, the myth of invincibility had cracked. That winter marked not just a physical defeat, but a psychological one. The Wehrmacht learned that the Red Army could recover, adapt, and strike back. Hitler, however, interpreted Barbarossa differently. To him, the setback before Moscow was not evidence of a flawed strategy, but of mistakes by his generals, delays that had squandered the momentum of his plan. He believed the Soviet Union had been mortally wounded, but had been allowed to recover. His conclusion was not to scale back his objectives, but to double down and seize the resources that had allowed Stalin to fight on. Oil above all loomed in Hitler's thinking. In his mind, the Soviet Union's southern regions were the true economic heart of the enemy war effort. Without the Caucasus, without the Dead Basin, the Red Army would grind to a halt. If the Wehrmacht could reach and hold these areas, the war in the east might finally bend to his will. And the weeks after the failure at Moscow, German planners tried to reconcile Hitler's ambitions with military reality. The army had suffered over 1 million casualties. Equipment losses were staggering. Supply networks stretched to breaking. Reinforcements were arriving, but not in the numbers needed for another giant offensive on the scale of Barbarossa. Even the weather posed problems. The Rasputza, the infamous Russian mud, would return with the autumn rains, constraining operations to the narrow window of summer. The High Command considered several options. One was a renewed attack on Moscow, but the troops and logistics required were immense. Another was a defensive pause, consolidating gains and preparing for 1943. Hitler rejected both. In Führer Directive No. 41, issued in April 1942, he made clear his decision. The main effort would shift south to seize the Caucasus and cut the Volga. This shift from Barbarossa to Blue represented more than a change of map coordinates. It was a change of emphasis from political to economic warfare. The capture of Moscow had been about decapitating Soviet administration and morale. The capture of the Caucasus was about strangling Soviet industry. Hitler envisioned a double envelopment, one force striking east towards Stalingrad on the Volga, severing a vital artery of transport and supply, another force thrusting south into the Caucasus, capturing the oil fields at Mop, Grozny, and eventually Baku. In theory, it was brilliant. Cut off the Red Army's fuel while denying it a key logistical corridor. In practice, it demanded more from the Wehrmacht than it could safely deliver. The German army was reorganized to meet this challenge. Army Group South, which had borne the brunt of the 1941 campaign in Ukraine, was reinforced and re-equipped. New panzer and infantry divisions were brought in, and the Luftwaffe concentrated its air fleets in the southern sector. At the same time, efforts were made to secure the flanks by recruiting and deploying Allied forces, Hungarian, Italian, Romanian divisions to guard the vast stretches of front that the Germans themselves could not cover. This multinational patchwork was a weakness masked as a strength. Many of these Allied units were poorly equipped and inadequately trained compared to the German formations, but Hitler saw them as sufficient for holding secondary sectors. While his elite troops drove forward within the general staff, there was an ease. Franz Halder and other senior officers worried about the sheer scale of the objectives and the dispersal of forces. They pointed out that the Red Army had not been destroyed in 1941, that it retained vast reserves and interior lines of communication. They feared a repeat of the overextension that had doomed Barbarossa. But Hitler brushed aside these objections. His faith in his own intuition had hardened into dogma. He no longer trusted his generals as he once had. Many of the seasoned commanders from the early war years had been sidelined, or replaced with officers more willing to execute Hitler's will without question. This shift in command culture from operational flexibility to top-down micromanagement would shape every phase of Case Blue. At the same time, the Soviets were drawing their own lessons from 1941. The Red Army's defeats had been catastrophic, but also instructive. New doctrines emphasized defense in depth, mobile reserves, and the use of the vast Soviet hinterland to absorb and exhaust enemy advances. Industrial production east of the Ural surged, churning out T-34 tanks and IL-2 attack aircraft in numbers unimaginable a year earlier. The Stavka prepared to defend the south not as a static line, but as a series of delaying positions, trading space for time, conserving their strength for counter-offensives. They also began building the foundations for strategic deception, feeding the Germans false information about Soviet intentions and dispositions. Thus, as the Germans planned Case Blue, the Soviets were already planning how to exploit its inevitable weaknesses. All of this, the competing lessons, the reallocation of forces, the shifting of goals, formed the backdrop to the transition from Barbarossa to Blue. The campaign of 1942 was not a mere continuation of 1941, but a test of whether Germany could adapt as quickly as its enemy. On paper, the plan promised decisive results. On the ground, it set the stage for a campaign of immense distances, logistical strain, and unprecedented stakes. For the men on both sides, the summer ahead would be one of movement and attrition, ambition and endurance, as two giant armies prepared to clash once again on the endless steppes of southern Russia. What made Case Blue so different from Barbarossa was not only geography, but also the changed character of the war. In 1941, the Germans had been the undisputed masters of mobile operations, slicing through Soviet lines with combined arms thrusts few armies on Earth could match. By mid-1942, however, the Red Army had learned to counter those tactics. New anti-tank guns, minefields, and layered defenses blunted the shock of panzer spearheads. Soviet engineers built fallback positions and fortified river lines, giving defenders time to regroup and counterattack. The Weremich's command still believed it could repeat the sweeping encirclements of the previous year, but it now faced an opponent less likely to collapse under pressure. In effect, both sides were racing to adapt, and Case Blue would be the proving ground for whose lessons had been better learned. Within the German High Command, planning sessions were tense. Officers responsible for logistics pored over train schedules and tonnage charts, calculating how much fuel, ammunition, and rations would be needed each day of the advance. The southern sector lacked the dense rail network of the western USA, and every extra kilometer meant fewer supplies at the front. Even the quality of roads varied dramatically. Long convoys of horse-drawn wagons, a relic of the previous century, would still be needed to haul supplies to fast-moving panzer units. These realities undercut the dazzling arrows on Hitler's maps. Staff officers knew that, if the advance slowed, fuel would run out and panzers would sit idle, vulnerable to counterattack. Yet, the political imperative for a decisive victory left little room for caution. Another lesson from Barbarossa was the danger of underestimating Soviet manpower. In 1941, the Germans had captured millions of prisoners and assumed the Red Army was finished. But replacements kept appearing, drawn from a population of hundreds of millions, and from factories now beyond the reach of German bombers. In planning Case Blue, Hitler accepted that the Soviets could still field large forces, but convinced himself that their quality was poor, their morale shaky. He envisioned quick collapses and mass surrenders similar to the encirclements at Kiev or Smolensk. This underestimation would prove costly because by 1942, the Red Army's cohesion and command structures were far stronger. Soviet officers had survived a Darwinian year of war, and were learning to handle large formations with skill. At the same time, the political stakes for Hitler had escalated. The Reich's allies were restive. Italy had suffered defeats in North Africa, and Rommel's Afrika Korps needed support. Japan remained bogged down in China, and had opened a new front with the United States. Germany's own economy was straining under the weight of total war, A decisive blow in the east that delivered resources and prestige was not just a military goal, but a means to reassure allies and the German public. This urgency fueled Hitler's determination to seize the Caucasus. Even if his generals doubted the feasibility, in his mind, failure was not an option. Success would solve the Reich's problems in one stroke. For the soldiers at the sharp end, the transition from Barbarossa to Blue felt like a march into the unknown. Letters and diaries show a mix of fatalism and hope. "We have been told this is the final push," wrote one infantryman from a Bavarian regiment. "If we take the oil fields, the war will be over." Others, veterans of the Moscow front, were less sanguine. They remembered frostbite, hunger, and endless retreats through snow, and they feared that the same might happen again on the sun-baked steppe. Yet the scale of preparations was impressive. New tanks, such as the Panzer IV with long-barreled guns, arrived at the front, and Luftwaffe squadrons bristling with J-87 dive bombers and Bf-109 fighters filled forward airfields. On the eve of the offensive, Miles Sorda's troops were told they were part of a campaign that would make history. The Soviets were making their own preparations. Stalin's government had learned hard lessons about evacuation and scorched earth. As German forces prepared to advance, local authorities were ordered to dismantle and move factories, destroy infrastructure, and evacuate livestock and civilians. Bridges were mined, oil wells prepared for demolition. The aim was to deny the Germans the resources they sought, and slow their progress across a land increasingly stripped bare. Soviet intelligence also fed misleading information to the Germans, hinting at offensives in other sectors to keep them guessing. In the south, new armies were forming, some to fight delaying actions, others to prepare for eventual counterstrikes. It was a chess game played on a continental board with both sides trying to anticipate the other's next move. Thus, by the spring of 1942, the lessons of Barbarossa had produced to mirror images. The Germans planned a bold thrust to seize economic prizes and deliver a strategic knockout. The Soviets planned to absorb the blow, conserve strength, and exploit the inevitable overextension of their enemy. Each believed the other's weaknesses would be decisive. Each was partly right. The coming campaign would be shaped not only by tanks and planes, but by the invisible forces of logistics, geography, and time. In this sense, the transition from Barbarossa to Blue was less a fresh start than the continuation of a contest, begun in June 1941, a test of endurance and adaptability on a scale the world had never seen. When the orders for Case Blue were finalized, the atmosphere in German headquarters was one of restrained excitement. Hitler announced that the offensive would begin in late June. Army Group South would break through Soviet lines on the Dets and drive toward the Lower Don. Once that was achieved, the forces would split. Army Group A would head into the Caucasus to seize the oil fields, while Army Group B would secure the Volga corridor and capture Stalingrad. This division of forces was bold to the point of recklessness, but Hitler believed speed and surprise would compensate. The decision would set in motion a chain of events, leading to some of the most famous battles of the war and ultimately to disaster. For now, however, the story of Case Blue was still one of plans on paper and troops on the march. The lessons of 1941 had been learned, but had they been learned deeply enough? Would the Wehrmachter's reconstituted strength be sufficient to deliver the decisive victory Hitler demanded? Or would the Red Army's growing power and strategic cunning turn the tables once again? As the final days of preparation ticked away, both armies stood poised at the threshold of a campaign that would determine not only the fate of the Southern Front, but the entire course of the Second World War. Chapter 3. The German war machine rebuilt. New divisions, new dreams. When the winter snows of 1941 finally released their grip on the Eastern Front, what emerged from the mud and wreckage was not only a battered German army, but a reawakening of German industry to the scale of the conflict it had entered. Case Blue would require not simply new plans, but a rebuilt war machine, a network of factories, training camps, and supply depots capable of feeding an offensive on a scale rivaling Barbarossa itself. In Berlin and deep inside the Reich, the Ministry of Armaments was working to expand production, squeezing every resource it could from occupied Europe. Steel from the Ruhr, coal from Sisha, grain from the Ukraine, oil from Romania. All of it was drawn together to rebuild the Wehrmacht's striking power. For many in the German command, the coming summer felt like a second chance, an opportunity to apply lessons learned and connect the mistakes of 1941. Factories that had slowed during the winter now ran day and night. The Panzer IV, the mainstay of German armored forces, received a long-barreled gun capable of knocking out the Soviet T-34 at greater ranges, and new batches rolled off the assembly lines. Self-propelled assault guns, mobile artillery, and half-tracks for motorized infantry were pushed forward to the front. Luftwaffe units received new Messerschmitt, Bf-109F fighters and J-87 Stukas, the latter adapted for greater bomb loads and protection. Even the humble field kitchen and horse-drawn wagon, staples of the German army, were produced in large numbers, for it was understood now that supply and mobility were as critical as firepower. Everything about the build-up spoke to a regime determined to make 1942 a year of decisive victory. Training also intensified. Replacements fresh from boot camps were drilled in combined arms tactics, encouraged to work closely with tanks and artillery, rather than fight as isolated infantry. New officers were trained to lead mobile operations across vast distances, and staff colleges lectured on the lessons of 1941, emphasizing coordination and speed. The Wehrmacht's logistical branches experimented with more flexible supply columns, trying to ensure that fuel and ammunition could keep up with the panzers. In occupied France and the Balkans, units recuperated and refitted before being transferred east, while on the Eastern Front itself, the spring thaw was used to repair rail lines, stockpile fuel, and prepare forward airfields. The entire southern wing of the German army was being groomed for a campaign, meant to dwarf its previous efforts. But behind the impressive build-up lurked unresolved problems. German industry, though powerful, was not yet fully mobilized for total war. Civilian goods still consumed significant resources and inter-vice rivalries siphoned off material. For pet projects, the Luftwaffe in particular drew heavily on industrial capacity for long-range bombers and experimental weapons that would never see decisive use. The result was a war machine formidable, but still patchwork relying on captured equipment and forced labor. In some panzer divisions, the newest long-barreled Panzers were mixed with older models and even captured French tanks, creating logistical headaches. The same was true for trucks, many of which were requisitioned civilian vehicles of every make and model, prone to breakdowns on Russia's primitive roads. This diversity of equipment foreshadowed the maintenance nightmares to come. Meanwhile, the Reich's allies were being integrated into the plan. Hungarian, Italian, and Romanian divisions were assigned to hold long stretches of front, freeing German units for the main thrust. This multinational force looked impressive on paper, but masked serious weaknesses. Many Allied formations lacked modern anti-tank weapons and adequate training for mobile warfare. They were brave but ill-prepared for the kind of mechanized onslaught the Red Army could unleash. German commanders privately doubted their staying power, but accepted them as a necessary expedient. Hitler, always eager to display Axis unity, saw their participation as proof that the campaign in the East was a shared struggle against Bolshevism. In reality, it would create fragile seams in his front lines. The morale of German troops during this period was complex. The new weapons and the influx of supplies boosted confidence. Propaganda promised a campaign of liberation for the peoples of the Caucasus, portraying them as oppressed by Moscow and eager to welcome the Wehrmacht. Soldiers were told they would find fertile farmlands, rich oil wells, and perhaps even sympathetic locals. Many believed it. Others were more skeptical, recalling how in Ukraine and Belarus, the promised welcome had turned sour as partisan warfare spread. Still, the prospect of movement, of finally escaping the trenches and dugouts of a static front, filled many with anticipation. The endless steppe lay ahead like an open stage, and they felt themselves actors in a drama larger than anything Europe had seen before. In Berlin, Joseph Goebbels' propaganda ministry prepared the narrative of victory. Newsreels showed gleaming tanks, disciplined troops, and maps with bold arrows slashing toward the Caucasus. Radio broadcasts spoke of securing Europe's future and delivering a mortal blow to Bolshevism. Even the language of the orders reflected this confidence. Case Blue was not described as a limited operation, but as a decisive offensive that would complete what Barbarossa had begun. For a republic weary of rationing and bombings, the promise of imminent victory was a potent tonic. Few outside the highest levels of command knew just how tenuous the reality behind the images was. All these preparations, the factors humming, the troops training, the propaganda churning, created the sense of a vast machinery awakening. Yet it was a machine with hidden fractures, a mosaic of strengths and weaknesses that would only reveal itself. Under the strain of the coming campaign, as spring turned to early summer, trains loaded with men, tanks, and horses rumbled eastward. They were the still sinners of Case Blue, stretching across Europe into the boundless spaces of Russia, where dreams of conquest and the hard lessons of reality were about to collide once more. As the troop trains clattered east, the scale of the enterprise became clearer to those who had to make it work. Case Blue was not a single punch, but a whole series of coordinated blows that would have to unfold across hundreds of miles. Every panzer battalion, every motorized column, every air wing depended on an invisible lattice of depot, repair shops, and fuel dumps stretching back through Poland into the Reich. The Wehrmachter's logistical officers had learned in 1941 how fragile this web could be, and in 1942, they worked frantically to strengthen it. Special railway brigades labored to convert Soviet broad-gauge tracks to German standards, a process that advanced just days behind the front. Fuel trains were fitted with armored guards to protect against partisans. Mobile repair units were attached to panzer divisions, their workshops mounted on trucks so they could keep up with the advance. In concept, it was a mechanized army marching on a mechanized supply system. But in practice, much of the hauling was still done by horses plodding through dust or mud, a 19th century reality under a 20th century facade. The influx of new equipment masked another problem: the erosion of Germany's experienced manpower. Many of the seasoned co's and officers who had led the Blitzkrieg of 1940 and the first months of Barbarossa had been killed, wounded, or rotated out. Their replacements were often younger and less seasoned, trained in compressed courses that emphasized technical skill, but not the instinctive judgment born of combat. The panzer divisions still bore famous names: Liebstander, Das Reich, Großdeutschland, but their corps had changed. Some were shells of their former selves, filled with recruits who had never seen battle. This generational shift would subtly change how the Wehrmacht fought, making it more reliant on rigid orders from above and less on the initiative that had been its hallmark. German industry tried to compensate for this with technology. New weapons were rushed to the front to give even inexperienced troops a fighting edge. The Panzer IV with its long 75mm gun was now considered the standard, but production lagged behind demand. The first batches of the new Tiger heavy tank were under development, but would not arrive in time to influence the early stages of Case Blue. Assault guns like the Stygge 3, cheaper and easier to build than tanks, proliferated as mobile artillery. The Luftwaffe emphasized tactical air power with Stukas and HS-1-9 ground attack aircraft, trained to support the armored spearheads. All of this was designed to recreate the shock and speed of 1941. But the scale of the theater and the resilience of the enemy meant that no amount of hardware could fully substitute for strategy and cohesion. At the same time, the political economy of the Reich was beginning to strain. Occupied Europe provided raw materials and forced labor, but inefficiencies abounded. Transportation bottlenecks slowed deliveries. Allied nations clamored for German weapons in exchange for their participation, further diverting production. The result was that, while the Wehrmacht looked formidable on paper, Its striking power rested on a precarious foundation. Even the fuel it so desperately needed from the Caucasus was already a limiting factor. Synthetic plants in Germany and oil from Romania could not fully meet the demand of the Panzer divisions and the Luftwaffe. Case Blue was conceived as the solution to this shortage. Yet it also depended on burning through vast amounts of the very resource it sought to capture. Morale within the multinational force reflected these contradictions. The Romanian and Hungarian troops guarding the flanks were motivated by their own national aims, but often felt like second-class partners, under-equipped and ordered into exposed positions. Italian divisions, many raised for mountain warfare, were unfamiliar with the open steppe. German officers tried to knit these disparate elements into a coherent front, but language barriers, doctrinal differences, and resentment made coordination difficult. In 1941, these weaknesses had been masked by rapid German victories. In 1942, as the front expanded and the Soviets grew stronger, the seams between Axis partners would become potential fault lines. Despite these fragilities, the mood in the Reich was one of anticipation. In the cities, Goebbels's propaganda machine promised an imminent decision in the east. Newsreels showed endless columns of tanks and aircraft heading for Russia, their crews smiling at the camera. Posters depicted the Caucasus Mountains and oil dergs as glittering prizes awaiting liberation. Even among soldiers at the front, such images fed a sense of destiny. Diaries and letters from June 1942 speak of finishing what we started and marching to the Volga. There was fatigue, yes, but also a belief that this new campaign, with its new weapons and renewed strength, would achieve the breakthrough that had eluded them the year before. What few outside the planning rooms understood was how much hinged on timing. The entire concept of Case Blue rested on speed. Outrun Soviet reinforcements, capture key objectives before the enemy could regroup, and live off seized resources to sustain the advance. Any delay could cascade into disaster. As supplies dwindled and the vast distances multiplied every logistical error. The Weremich's rebuilt divisions were impressive instruments, but they were instruments designed for a blitz, not a prolonged slugging match. Hitler's insistence on splitting his forces, one thrust towards Stalingrad, the other into the Caucasus, would further magnify the demands on this system. In that decision lay the seeds of the coming crisis. For now, though, in early summer 1942, the rebuilt German war machine looked like a juggernaut. Train after train delivered men and material to the steppe. Airfields bristled with aircraft, motor pools with trucks and tanks. The soldiers who climbed down from those trains saw a landscape of endless grass and sky, and ahead of them the promise of movement, of victory, of oil. They could not know that within months the same trains would carry survivors back west in retreat, or that the names of distant towns Stalingrad, Mop, Novorossiysk would become synonyms for frustration and loss in the long shimmering days before the offensive began. All of that lay hidden beyond the horizon as the German war machine rebuilt and rechristened, prepared to launch itself into the vastness once more. Chapter 4. The Oil of the Caucasus. Why Hitler's eyes turned south long before the first German soldier set foot on the plains of southern Russia. The oil fields of the Caucasus were etched in Hitler's mind like a shimmering mirage. In his private conversations and war directives, he often returned to them almost obsessively, as though the flow of crude from makeup. Grozny and Baku could decide the fate of empires. Germany's entire strategy for 1942 rested on this conviction. After a winter of mud, frostbite, and exhaustion, Hitler had emerged from the ruins of Barbarossa with a new priority. Not Moscow, not Leningrad, but oil. He saw in the black rivers of the Caucasus not only the lifeblood of the Soviet Union, but the key to sustaining his own war machine. Without it, he told his generals, the Reich would grind to a halt. With it, the Soviets would suffocate and Britain might finally be forced to the negotiating table. This obsession had roots deeper than the war itself. German strategists since the First World War had known how precarious their energy supply was. Britain and the United States had global access to petroleum. Germany had coal and a few synthetic plants. Romania's pesky fields were valuable but insufficient. Every mile the panzer divisions advanced consumed thousands of liters of fuel. Every sortie of the Luftwaffe burned precious aviation gasoline. Hitler's gamble in 1941 had already strained these reserves. By 1942, the Reich's fuel deficit was becoming acute. The Caucasus, with its vast deposits and pipelines stretching to the Black and Caspian seas, appeared as a solution, glittering on the southern horizon. But oil was more than a technical resource. In Hitler's imagination, it was also a symbol of victory over Bolshevism. The Caucasus represented the industrial heart of the Soviet Union's southern flank, a region of oil, manganese, and grain tied to the war effort by steel rails and rivers. Seizing it would not only deprive Stalin of fuel for tanks and planes, but also split his empire, severing the link between European Russia and the Middle East. Hitler dreamed of his troops reaching not just the Caucasus, but beyond to Persia, to Iraq, to India, where he imagined a vast Axis zone stretching from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean. In this vision, the seizure of oil was the first step to global transformation. The reality on the ground, however, was infinitely more complex. The Caucasus was not an empty prize, but a fortress of geography. Snow-capped peaks rose like walls with passes that could be defended by a handful of determined troops. Oil wells could be sabotaged or set alight before capture. Pipelines blown up, refineries rendered useless. Even reaching them required crossing hundreds of miles of steppe. Rivers like the Don and the Kubin, and the industrial city of Stalingrad, guarding the Volga. German planners understood some of these obstacles, but Hitler's directives often brushed them aside. He issued orders demanding the oil fields be captured intact, a demand that would prove almost fantastical once the Soviets began their scorched earth retreat. Inside the Wehrmacht, debates simmered. Generals like Holder and Bock worried about the distances and the splitting of army groups south. Others like von Wakes and List accepted the challenge, but fretted over supplies. Yet few dared to contradict Hitler openly. The oil narrative was too powerful, promised not just a campaign, but a cure for Germany's strategic disease. By March 1942, the war directive known as Full Blow or Case Blue had been finalized, and it placed the Caucasus oil at the center of the summer offensive. Maps were printed showing Makeup, Grozny, and Baku as target objectives. In Berlin, engineers began studying how to repair captured refineries. Propaganda films showed Dirks and pipelines as though they were already German possessions. For the soldiers who would have to march and fight, this talk of oil was abstract. Letters and diaries from frontline troops in the spring of 1942 reveal little understanding of why they were being shifted south. Some thought they were heading for a final push on Moscow. Others guessed they might be going to seize the Black Sea ports or cut off British aid from Iran. Only a few, usually officers with access to planning documents, wrote about oil as the goal. Yet, even without knowing, the men felt the change in direction. Train journeys now ended in dusty stations of Ukraine instead of forests around Smolensk. Supply dumps sprouted near the Don steppe, stacked with jerkins, mountain gear, and bridging equipment for river crossings. The Soviet leadership, too, was aware of the threat. Stalin's intelligence services had picked up hints of German interest in the south. As early as February, he reinforced the Caucasus front, ordered new defenses along the Don, and prepared plans to destroy all facilities if retreat became necessary. In May 1942, when the Red Army launched an ill-fated offensive at Kharkov, it was partly an attempt to disrupt the German build-up for Case Blue. The result was a disaster for the Soviets, another encirclement and tens of thousands of prisoners, but it did not erase their awareness of what was coming. By the time the German spearheads began to roll east in June, Stalin had already begun moving skilled oil workers and key equipment out of the Caucasus to the Urals in Central Asia, a quiet evacuation that would limit the effectiveness of any German capture. Yet in the spring sunlight of 1942, the German High Command was not thinking about scorched earth or evacuation. They imagined with a blend of arrogance and wishful thinking that The oil fields would fall into their hands like ripe fruit. Engineers were instructed to prepare to restart production within weeks of capture. Tanker trains and barges were earmarked to carry the oil west. The Luftwaffe planned to deploy squadrons to protect the pipelines and refiners from Soviet sabotage. Even SS economic agencies drew up lists of how to exploit the conquered region, including forced labor, resource extraction, and ideological reordering of the ethnically diverse Caucasus population. In Berlin, such plans made it seem as if the oil was already flowing, a mirage of abundance shimmering over the maps. For a historian looking back, this moment stands out as a convergence of fantasy and necessity. Hitler's southern strategy in 1942 was not simply a gamble. It was born of genuine material desperation, yet pursued with an ideological fervor that blinded him to practicalities. Oil was both the means and the end. To capture it, he would overextend his armies, divert resources from other sectors, and commit to a campaign in Tain his forces were all suited to conquer. That tension between the dream of oil and the reality of the Caucasus would define the coming months of blood and struggle on the Eastern Front. By midsummer 1942, the vision of oil had become a gravitational pull around which the entire southern wing of the Eastern Front revolved. As the first phase of Case Blue succeeded, German spearheads sweeping across the Donbass, Soviet lines cracking under pressure. The maps in Hitler's headquarters began to sprout arrows, leading ever farther south. Each daily situation reports spoke of new towns taken, new crossings secured. But behind the dry language lurked an enormous gamble. The Wehrmacht was moving away from its secure supply base and into a widening funnel of steppe and mountains, with the Caucasus oil fields glittering at the far end like a prize that kept receding. Inside the planning staffs, officers drew up targets as if logistics could be tamed by ink. Mop was to be captured in August, Grozny by September, and Baku far to the southeast on the Caspian Sea. By the onset of winter, the Luftwaffe's 4th Air Fleet received orders to protect captured oil installations from the air. Engineers studied Soviet pipelines to learn how to reverse their flow toward the west. Even shipping on the Black Sea and Caspian was considered, with proposals for using barges and tankers to move fuel once the wells were seized. On paper, the plan read like a corporate acquisition, a hostile takeover of an enemy's energy assets. On the ground, however, it would require armies to march hundreds of miles, cross multiple rivers, scale mountain passes, and fight a determined opponent who knew exactly what was at stake. The Caucasus itself was not merely a resource depot. It was a mosaic of peoples: Russians, Ukrainians, Armenians, Georgians, Chechens, Asians, bound to the Soviet state in different ways. Nazi planners saw opportunity in this diversity. Some in the Reich Ministry for the occupied Eastern Territories proposed setting up puppet administrations or encouraging separatist movements to ease German control. Others dreamed of colonization, replacing undesirable populations with ethnic Germans. These schemes revealed how the conquest of oil was entwined with the regime's racial ideology. Case Blue was not just an economic campaign, but also an imperial one, promising a new order in the south as well as fuel for the war. Yet the Watch's actual approach to local populations would be shaped more by necessity than by grand plans. As German units advanced, they encountered villages with their own grievances against Moscow, but also deep suspicion of foreign invaders. Some communities provided guides or supplies, others resisted or fled into the mountains. Partisan activity increased along the stretched German lines of communication, blowing up bridges and ambushing convoys. Every act of sabotage meant more fuel consumed, more time lost, and more troops diverted to security duties. Small cuts that accumulated into a weakening of the offensive's momentum. At the same time, Soviet countermeasures were accelerating. Stalin's orders to destroy the oil infrastructure if retreat became inevitable were executed with grim thoroughness. In makeup, Soviet engineers wired wells and refineries with explosives, and when German troops finally reached the city, they found a landscape of scorched earths, crumpled pipelines, and burning storage tanks. Grozny and Baku were similarly prepared. Entire technical staffs were evacuated eastward. Taking with them blueprints, equipment, and expertise, the Soviets were determined that, even if the Germans reached the Caucasus, they would capture little more than smoldering ruins. For the soldiers advancing under the hot southern sun, these grand strategic aims translated into grueling marches, frequent river crossings, and long supply lines. Fuel shortages began to bite even before the mountains. Convoys stretched for miles, vulnerable to air attack and guerrilla raids. Panzer units often had to halt while fuel was brought forward, undermining the very speed on which blitzkrieg depended. Horses once again became essential for hauling supplies, a jarring sight in an army celebrated for mechanized warfare. The deeper into the south they pushed, the more the illusion of an easy conquest dissolved. Hitler, however, remained convinced that the oil was within reach. His directives grew more insistent, sometimes micromanaging at the level of individual divisions. He demanded that captured wells be made operational immediately, berated his generals for slow progress, and shifted forces from one thrust to another in pursuit of his goals. This impatience exacerbated the already complex command structure. The splitting of Army Group South into two separate forces, one aimed at Stalingrad, the other at the Caucasus, was meant to hasten the offensive, but instead divided resources and blurred priorities. The oil remained the ultimate objective, yet its pursuit began to pull the Wehrmacht in conflicting directions. For a listener drifting off to the slow rhythm of history, this phase of Case Blue has a strangely hypnotic quality, the dream of boundless fuel, drawing an army ever deeper into hostile territory. Like a caravan chasing a mirage across the desert, each day's advance promised the goal was closer, yet each step also lengthened the supply lines and increased the strain. The Caucasus with its snow peaks and labyrinth and valleys loomed ahead, not as a prize, but as a barrier. Even the names of the places, Rostov, Mop, Grozny, took on an incantatory sound, markers in a saga of ambition and overreach. Late summer, as German units crested the first foothills of the Caucasus, the contradictions of the southern strategy were becoming visible, even to the most optimistic officers. The oil they sought was burning or dismantled. The Soviet army, though battered, was regrouping. Winter was creeping closer, yet the orders still spoke of Baku and the Persian frontier, as if they were only a campaign away. In this tension between plan and reality, between oil as salvation and oil as illusion, lay the heart of Operation Blue's southern drive. Chapter 5. Operation Blue begins. The push across the Don Steppe. By the last days of June 1942, the vast German army assembled for Case Blue had become a sprawling humming machine, a force unlike any seen in the East since the beginning of Barbarossa. Soldiers, tanks, artillery, and aircraft were arrayed along a front that stretched from southern Ukraine to the Don River, a line of human and mechanical sinews ready to drive deep into Soviet territory. The months of preparation, training, and re-equipping now converged on a single objective: to pierce the Soviet southern defenses, secure the Don Steppe, and open the road to Stalingrad and the Caucasus. From the German High Command's perspective, the operation promised rapid victory. From the Soviet viewpoint, it was the opening of another deadly trial on a front already soaked in blood. The steppe itself was an unbroken expanse of grass dotted with small villages, winding rivers, and patches of forest. Its openness offered little cover for infantry, but was ideal for the panzer spearheads that would lead the advance. For months, German engineers and scouts had studied the terrain, planning routes for tanks and trucks, identifying river crossings, and constructing temporary bridges. Supply depots were built behind the lines to feed the advancing troops, though even the best planning could not entirely compensate for the sheer distances involved. Every kilometer the army moved stretched the web of logistics further, making fuel, ammunition, and food critical vulnerabilities Officers were acutely aware that speed would be both their ally and their constant challenge. The Luftwaffe played a decisive role from the outset. Waves of bombers and dive bombers cleared the skies of Soviet reconnaissance planes, destroyed artillery positions, and disrupted railway lines feeding the front. Fighter squadrons patrolled overhead to protect the advancing columns. Air supremacy, the Germans believed, would smooth the way for the panzers and mechanized infantry to penetrate the Soviet defenses. For the Soviet troops stationed along the Don, this aerial dominance was terrifying. Airfields were quickly rendered unusable, convoys were shattered from above, and communications became fragmented under the relentless pressure of attacks from the sky. Yet even under fire, Soviet commanders tried to stabilize their lines, deploying reserves to reinforce weak points, and buying time to implement defensive measures further east. German strategy emphasized speed and encirclement. The initial attacks were concentrated on narrow sectors to break through the Soviet lines. Before they could adjust, panzer divisions roared forward in tightly coordinated formations, their engines drowning out the cries of infantry behind them. Artillery barges preceded each assault, creating temporary gaps in Soviet fortifications. The rhythm of attack was designed to shock and overwhelm, reminiscent of the tactics that had led to victory at Kiev and Smolensk in 1941. However, the distances of the Don steppe were greater, and the Soviets, though weakened, had learned to trade space for time, retreating strategically while inflicting attritional damage. Communication and command were critical. German headquarters, perched hundreds of kilometers from the spearheads, relied on radio and teleprinter networks to issue orders and receive updates. Messengers on motorcycles and in light vehicles bridged the gaps where signals were lost. Yet the pace of the advance sometimes outstripped these networks, leaving panzer units to make critical decisions independently. The result was both opportunity and risk. Local commanders could exploit gaps in Soviet lines, but they could also move too far ahead, isolated from support and vulnerable to counterattack. As the war pushed forward, the Soviet defense strategy became apparent. Rather than holding rigid lines, they used a series of fallback positions, mines, and barricades to slow the German advance. Artillery units often dug into concealed positions, inflicted casualties even as infantry units withdrew in good order. When German forces encountered strongpoints, Stuka dive bombers would strike. Yet, Soviet troops frequently melted into forests or villages, reappearing further down the line to continue resistance. The fighting was methodical, not continuous, giving the impression of steady progress while hiding the growing logistical strain on the German forces. The human dimension of the operation was equally significant. German soldiers were confronted not just with enemy fire, but with heat, dust, and the monotony of endless plains. Horses still pulled wagons, supplying fuel, rations, and ammunition, their pace slower than mechanized units and often causing delays. Infantrymen marched 4 miles under the summer sun, carrying heavy packs and enduring long hours in open terrain. Letters from the front describe a mixture of awe and fatigue, troops aware that they were part of a massive movement across a historically contested landscape, yet wary of what lay beyond each river or village. Despite these challenges, the early days of Case Blue went largely according to plan. Soviet resistance was stubborn but localized, allowing the main German thrust to advance steadily. Villages fell, railway junctions were captured, and bridges over the Don were secured, sometimes intact, sometimes after hurried engineering repairs. The pace of the advance, while slower than Hitler had ideally hoped, still represented a significant penetration of the southern Soviet front. In Berlin, reports were received with cautious optimism. Newspapers and radio broadcasts highlighted decisive gains and the march toward the oil fields, feeding both military and civilian confidence in the offensive. Yet, even in these early successes, the first warning signs of overreach began to appear. Fuel consumption rose sharply as convoys lengthened. Panzer units occasionally outpaced infantry support, leaving flanks vulnerable. Communications stretched to the limit, sometimes resulted in delayed or contradictory orders. The Soviet defenders, though falling back, absorbed lessons from every clash, preparing for a counterstroke that would exploit these emerging vulnerabilities. In essence, the Dawn Steppe had become both a path of opportunity and a landscape of risk, where victory depended not only on brute force, but on the careful orchestration of logistics, timing, and human endurance that ironed this first phase of the German southern drive. The rhythm of war was mesmerizing in its scale and sweep. One could almost imagine the sun setting over the Don, casting long shadows of tanks and trucks, the distant rumble of artillery echoing across the steppe. To a modern observer or a listener drifting into sleep, there is a hypnotic cadence to the description. The endless plains, the coordinated surge of a mechanized army, the interplay of strategy, logistics, and human endeavor, all moving toward an objective shimmering with promise, yet fraught with danger. Case Blue had begun, and the stage was set for the monumental struggles to come at Stalingrad, along the Don, and eventually in the mountains of the Caucasus. As July 1942 unfolded, the Weremich's advance across the Dawn Steppe accelerated, and the scale of the operation became increasingly apparent. The panzers and motorized infantry pushed east with a relentless rhythm, bridging rivers, sweeping past villages, and absorbing the occasional Soviet ambush. Each day's progress was measured not only in kilometers, but in the disruption of Soviet defensive networks. The German command understood that speed was essential. Every hour of delay allowed reserves from the interior to move closer. Every bridge destroyed required hours of engineering repair, and every overstretched convoy risked attack by partisans or Soviet aircraft. Logistics as much as strategy would determine the ultimate success of the offensive. German commanders had meticulously planned the advance along narrow axes, concentrating their forces to break through weak points in Soviet lines. Panzer groups often spearheaded attacks in wedge formations, flanked by infantry and supported by artillery. Reconnaissance units scouted ahead, reporting on terrain obstacles and enemy dispositions. Where the Soviets had fortified positions, they were met with combined assaults. Artillery barges softened defenses, Stuka dive bombers strafed trenches, and tanks advanced to crush remaining resistance. The strategy relied on coordination and timing, a complex dance across a landscape hundreds of km wide. The Soviet defenders, despite previous defeats, were far from passive. Their tactics emphasized depth and flexibility. Units would initially resist German attacks, but then withdraw strategically, establishing secondary lines to slow the enemy's momentum. Mines and barricades forced panzer units to halt and engineers to clear paths, exposing them to artillery fire. These tactics reflected a sophisticated understanding of German methods. The Red Army had studied the lessons of 1941 carefully, and officers increasingly trusted initiative at lower levels. Even in retreat, Soviet units aimed to inflict casualties and complicate German logistics. The open steppe, while advantageous for armored warfare, exposed German troops to environmental hazards. Summer heat, combined with dust and dehydration, took a toll on soldiers and horses alike. Mechanical failures became frequent. Engines overheated, tracks broke, and fuel shortages forced panzers to halt. The reliance on horses for supply transport, a vestige of earlier conflicts, highlighted the limits of Germany's mechanization. Infantry trudged long distances under relentless sun, carrying rations, ammunition, and equipment, their boots stirring clouds of dust that blanketed the advancing columns. Yet despite exhaustion, the sense of movement, the ability to penetrate deeply into enemy territory, sustained morale. Strategically, the first major objective was to secure the Lower Don, the gateway to Stalingrad and the southern oil fields. German engineers built pontoon bridges, repaired partially destroyed crossings, and coordinated with Luftwaffe units to suppress Soviet artillery along riverbanks. Panzer divisions exploited any breach, rapidly expanding the corridor and enveloping retreating Soviet formations. The Soviets responded, by deploying reserves to threaten sectors, sometimes launching counterattacks to stall the advance. These encounters were fierce but localized, as the Germans generally retained the initiative and dictated the pace of operations. However, the wider picture revealed the vulnerabilities inherent in Hitler's southern thrust. The division of Army Group South into Army Groups A and B, tasked respectively with the Caucasus and Stalingrad objectives, stretched resources thin. Flanks were covered by Romanian and Italian formations, many under-equipped and inadequately trained for mobile defensive operations. German commanders occasionally had to detach elite units to reinforce these weaker allies, slowing the main advance. Fuel consumption soared as panzer units moved further from depots, and logistical trains were increasingly stretched over hundreds of kilometers. Every delay amplified the risk that Soviet reserves could exploit weaknesses, threatening encirclement of forward units at a tedious human level. Soldiers experienced a mixture of exhilaration and anxiety. Letters and diaries describe the awe of vast open plains and the satisfaction of continuous progress. Yet they also hint at unease. The steppe offered no cover, and the enemy could strike from hidden artillery, ambushes, or sudden counterattacks. The realization that winter would eventually return, that supply lines could not be infinitely stretched, and that the enemy was far from vanquished weighed on both officers and enlisted men. The pace was intoxicating, but also a test of endurance, patience, and tactical skill. Propaganda continued to frame the campaign as an unstoppable advance. German radio and newspapers celebrated the capture of towns along the Don, emphasizing the near certainty of reaching Stalingrad and the Caucasus oil fields. Soldiers, while aware of the hazards, were buoyed by this narrative, believing they were part of a decisive historical moment. Yet beneath the headlines and the official reports, the first signs of strain were mounting. Logistics, fatigue, the vast distances, and the relentless nature of the terrain hinted that the dream of a lightning victory might prove more fragile than anticipated. By mid-July, the Wareham had advanced far beyond the positions they had held at the beginning of the summer. German units controlled key towns, railroad junctions, and river crossings. Yet the further they moved east and south, the more tenuous their supply lines became. The Soviets, though retreating, continued to fight strategically, delaying, sabotaging, and preparing positions for the inevitable showdown at Stalingrad. The Don steppe, initially a corridor of rapid advance, was beginning to reveal its dual character, a stage for spectacular maneuvers and a gauntlet of logistical and operational challenges. I am reflecting on this phase. One sees the hypnotic rhythm of Case Blue, an army surging across open plains, propelled by ambition, technology, and ideology, yet constantly aware that the further it moved, the more the terrain and enemy conspired against it. For the soldiers and commanders, the pace, the scale, and the vast distances were both thrilling and perilous. The first stage of the offensive, the push across the Don steppe, had succeeded in its immediate tactical objectives, but it also exposed the vulnerabilities that would define the next more critical chapters of the campaign, including the fateful approach to Stalingrad and the treacherous Caucasus. Chapter 6: Crossing the Don. Encounters and encirclements. As the German advance stretched across the vast southern plains of the Soviet Union in mid-1942, the Don River emerged not just as a geographic landmark, but as a formidable obstacle, both natural and tactical. The Wehrmacht, having pushed through the Don steppe, faced the challenge of securing crossings over a river that had historically been a strategic barrier in Russian campaigns. For the German planners, the Don was a gateway. Controlling its banks meant controlling the approaches to Stalingrad and opening the path south toward the Caucasus oil fields. But the river's defenders were not passive. The Soviets had spent months preparing fortifications, deploying artillery, and digging defensive lines along its course. What awaited the Germans was a mixture of fierce resistance, clever countermeasures, and the ever-present threat of overextension. The first encounters with Soviet forces along the Don revealed the depth of the Red Army's strategic planning. While German intelligence had underestimated the resilience of some formations, the Soviets had concentrated artillery, machine gun nests, and infantry in positions designed to maximize the river's natural defensive advantages. Small towns and villages along the banks became fortified outposts used to anchor defenses and delay armored advances. Mines and obstacles were laid in depth, and engineers had partially demolished bridges to slow the Weremich's progress. For the German units, the crossings were less a simple tactical maneuver and more a logistical and operational trial, testing coordination between infantry, engineers, and panzers under enemy fire. German doctrine emphasized rapid penetration and encirclement, and planners sought to replicate the successes of Barbarossa's early months. Pontoon bridges were prepared, and engineers moved forward with bridging equipment. To establish temporary crossings, artillery units provided suppressive fire, while Stuka dive bombers struck Soviet positions from above. Panzer divisions formed spearheads, attempting to punch through weak points in the defenses and create corridors for the infantry to follow. Yet, even with superior coordination and air support, the Germans faced delays. Some bridges were destroyed faster than engineers could repair them. Soviet artillery harassed crossing points with deadly precision, and counterattacks threatened to isolate advanced units. The rhythm of advance became punctuated by tense pauses and desperate firefights along the riverbanks. The human cost of these encounters was significant. German infantrymen, already fatigued by weeks of marching under the summer sun, had to negotiate exposed terrain under enemy fire. Casualties mounted, and field hospitals were stretched to their limits. Panzer crews struggled with mechanical breakdowns exacerbated by dust, heat, and constant movement. Even the Luftwaffe, dominant in the skies, could not fully suppress Soviet artillery and small unit harassment. Soldiers wrote in diaries of the surreal mixture of exhilaration and dread. The excitement of pushing forward weighed against the knowledge that any misstep at a river crossing could result in encirclement and destruction. Soviet tactics along the Don displayed a growing sophistication. Commanders did not attempt to hold every inch of territory rigidly. Instead, they implemented depth defense, allowing German forces to advance into prepared zones where artillery, mines, and counterattacks could inflict maximum casualties. In some sectors, Soviet armored units lay in ambush behind the river, attacking German flanks and supply lines. These actions demonstrated a key evolution from the previous year. The Red Army had become flexible, adaptive, and willing to absorb initial losses to achieve longer-term strategic goals. For the Germans, this was a stark reminder that Soviet resistance was no longer prone to collapse under pressure. Encirclement tactics became a feature of the fighting along the Don. German commanders aimed to envelop Soviet units caught near river crossings, using fast-moving panzers to close pockets and infantry to consolidate control. Some operations succeeded spectacularly, capturing thousands of prisoners and creating temporary corridors of control. Others faltered when Soviet reinforcements appeared faster than anticipated, or when German columns advanced too far ahead of their support. These encounters highlighted a recurring theme of Case Blue. Initial tactical successes often created new strategic vulnerabilities, stretching supply lines and exposing units to counterattacks. The operational tempo along the Don was further complicated by environmental factors. Summer heat baked the plains, while sudden thunderstorms turned roads into quagmires of mud, slowing mechanized units. Dust from advancing columns created low visibility, complicating coordination between panzers, artillery, and aircraft. Rivers swollen by rainfall sometimes rendered planned crossings unusable, forcing engineers to improvise under fire. Soldiers and animals alike endured punishing conditions, a reminder that in war, nature is as formidable an adversary as any enemy. Despite these challenges, German propaganda painted a different picture. Berlin received reports emphasizing rapid advances, captured towns, and the imminent opening of the road to Stalingrad. Soldiers were told that their efforts would secure the resources necessary to win the war, and that every crossing of the Don brought them closer to the oil of the Caucasus. This narrative reinforced morale even as the realities on the ground, casualties, logistical strain, and resilient Soviet defenses, told a more complicated story. As July drew to a close, the Wehrmacht forces along the Don had secured several key crossing points and established bridge heads on the far bank. Panzer divisions had penetrated deeper into Soviet territory, opening paths for the infantry and supply trains to follow. Yet the further east they moved, the more tenuous their positions became. Encirclement threats, partisan attacks on supply lines, and the sheer scale of the operation began to weigh heavily on commanders and troops alike. The Don crossings, initially envisioned as stepping stones, were rapidly revealing themselves as complex operations that required constant adaptation and coordination. In the hypnotic rhythm of the summer campaign, the Don River symbolized both progress and peril. For the German army, it was the threshold to Stalingrad and the Caucasus, a bridge between ambition and reality. For the Soviets, it was a line to slow the invader trade space for time and prepare the battlefield for the counter-offensives that would come in the months ahead. In these first encounters and encirclements along the Don, the dynamics of case blue speed, overextension, tactical brilliance, and strategic vulnerability were on full display, setting the stage for the epic confrontations that would soon engulf Stalingrad, the Volga, and the southern Soviet plains. As the Wehrmacht consolidated its bridgeheads across the Don in late July 1942, the complexity of Case Blue began to crystallize. Securing river crossings was only the first of many challenges in a campaign designed to reach the Caucasus oil fields and Stalingrad. Behind every tactical victory lay logistical strain, environmental hazards, and a determined enemy adapting to the rhythm of German attacks. German commanders now faced the delicate task of exploiting initial successes, while guarding against the very encirclements and counterattacks they themselves had inflicted on the Soviets. In this phase, the interplay of speed, supply, and human endurance became more pronounced than ever. Panzer divisions, the spearheads of the southern advance, found themselves stretching thin across the riverbanks. The fast-moving units often outpaced infantry and supply columns, leaving isolated pockets vulnerable to Soviet artillery and counterattacks. German staff officers meticulously calculated fuel usage, ammunition consumption, and the timing of reinforcements, but the reality on the ground was dynamic and chaotic. Convoys faced long delays, and bridges, though captured, remained vulnerable to demolition or sabotage. Each success in crossing the Don required constant attention to detail, as even minor disruptions could cascade into operational crisis. Soviet forces along the Don adopted a strategy of flexible defense and tactical withdrawal. Rather than attempting to hold every kilometer, they created a series of strong points and fallback positions that would delay the Germans, while minimizing their own losses. Artillery batteries concealed in forests, villages, and river bends harassed advancing columns. Infantry units, often supplemented by local partisans, conducted ambushes and nighttime raids, further complicating German operations. The Red Army strategy emphasized attrition, trading territory for time to regroup reserves and fortify positions further east. This approach contrasted sharply with the rapid thrusts that had characterized German advances in 1941. Signaling a shift in Soviet operational doctrine. One of the most striking aspects of the Don crossings was the human toll. German soldiers, already fatigued by weeks of marches across the steppe, endured relentless sun, dust, and exposure along the riverbanks. Infantrymen slogged through mud and waded across streams under enemy fire, while engineers worked around the clock to construct pontoon bridges. Horses and vehicles strained under the weight of supplies and equipment, and mechanical failures became increasingly common. Letters and diaries from the front speak of exhaustion tempered by the thrill of movement, the sense that each day brought the army closer to decisive objectives. Even as danger and fatigue mounted, the Luftwaffe remained a critical factor in securing the river crossings. Fighter bombers patrolled ahead of advancing columns, strafing Soviet positions and providing reconnaissance for commanders. Dive bombers targeted artillery supply depot and reinforcements attempting to suppress enemy defenses. Despite this, Soviet anti-aircraft fire and sporadic air counterattacks created constant tension. The interplay between ground forces and air support was delicate. Any miscalculation could result in friendly fire or allow Soviet forces to regroup. German success relied not just on technology, but on precise coordination and timing, underscoring the complexity of modern mechanized warfare. Encirclement operations became a defining feature of the fighting along the Don. German commanders sought to trap Soviet units attempting to resist the river crossings. Rapid advances by armored columns were intended to pinch off retreating forces, while infantry secured surrounding terrain. In some cases, these maneuvers succeeded spectacularly, capturing thousands of prisoners and creating temporary corridors of control. In others, Soviet units slipped through gaps, melting into forests or retreating to prepared positions further east. These encounters demonstrated that, even in the midst of tactical brilliance, unpredictability and adaptability on both sides could alter outcomes. Logistics remained a persistent challenge. Fuel consumption soared as armored units moved further from supply depots. Ammunition shortages occasionally forced units to halt, leaving them exposed. Repair crews worked day and night to maintain vehicles, often improvising in the field. Even the simplest task, such as moving rations to the front, became an ordeal over the hundreds of kilometers separating supply points from active combat zones. Every kilometer of advance increased the strain on personnel and equipment, highlighting the fragile foundation upon which the German southern offensive rested. Not by the end of July, the Wehrmacht had established a series of bridgeheads and pushed several panzer divisions beyond the Don. Key towns, railway junctions, and crossing points were secured, providing temporary stability to the advancing front. Yet, the deeper the Germans moved, the more tenuous their positions became. Partisan attacks on supply lines intensified. The weather added unpredictability, and the Soviets, far from defeated, prepared for counter-offensives that would soon test the limits of German operational capacity. The Don River, once merely a geographic feature, had become a crucible in which the strength, coordination, and endurance of the German army were measured. For those observing the campaign from Berlin or listening through radio broadcasts, the narrative remained one of unstoppable advance. Towns taken, prisoners captured, and crossing points secured were presented as evidence of inevitable victory. On the ground, however, commanders and soldiers knew a more complex reality. Every tactical gain carried the potential for overextension. Every river crossed opened new challenges, and every kilometer advanced increased vulnerability. In this interplay of triumph and risk, Case Blue's southern thrust revealed its dual nature, both as a showcase of German operational skill and as a precursor to the grueling decisive battles that lay ahead at Stalingrad and the Caucasus. The Dawn crossings, with their blend of speed, encirclement, and attritional challenges, became emblematic of the entire campaign. They highlighted the Wehrmacht's strengths, coordination, mechanization, and initiative, while exposing vulnerabilities in logistics, command, and endurance. As August approached, the stage was set for the next dramatic chapter, the approach to Stalingrad, where the dream of oil and the ambition of Case Blue would collide with the full resilience of the Soviet defense. Chapter 7. The Road to Stalingrad: Momentum and Miscalculations. By early August 1942, the Wehrmacht had achieved remarkable momentum along the southern front. Panzer columns roared across the steppe. Infantry marched with grim determination, and the Luftwaffe dominated the skies. Case Blue appeared to be unfolding according to plan. German forces had crossed the Don, established bridgeheads, and pressed eastward towards Stalingrad, the city perched on the Volga, whose capture promised not only strategic control of river transport, but also a psychological blow to the Soviets. Hitler, confident in his general's abilities and the renewed strength of the German army, believed that the road to Stalingrad could be traversed rapidly, opening the way to the Caucasus oil fields beyond. Yet beneath this surface of apparent success, the campaign was beginning to reveal the cracks that would later define its fate. The geography of southern Russia was both a facilitator and a challenge. The open steppe allowed rapid mechanized advances, but it offered little natural cover. Soviet forces, though stretched thin, used this to their advantage by establishing strong points in villages, fortified rail junctions, and elevated terrain. Every German breakthrough was met with artillery barrages and occasional counterattacks designed to slow the advance, buying time for reserves and reinforcing units further east. Panzer divisions, despite their speed and firepower, found themselves occasionally overextended, requiring careful coordination with infantry, engineers, and logistical support to maintain the momentum. Hitler's strategic vision further complicated operational realities. His obsession with simultaneously seizing Stalingrad and advancing into the Caucasus meant that Army Group South had to be split into two distinct thrusts. Army Group A aimed at the oil fields and Army Group B directed toward the Volga. This division of forces, while theoretically allowing for two decisive operations, introduced logistical and command challenges that would strain German capacity. The split meant that supplies, reinforcements, and air support had to be allocated with extreme precision. Any miscalculation risked leaving one of the thrusts exposed to counterattack. Commanders on the ground frequently wrestled with conflicting directives, caught between Hitler's ideological insistence and the operational realities of a vast fluid front. The Luftwaffe continued to play a decisive role in facilitating the advance. Fighter bombers patrolled ahead of the armored spearheads, suppressing Soviet artillery and reconnaissance. Stukas and other ground attack aircraft disrupted defensive positions and railway networks, attempting to paralyze Soviet supply and communication. Yet even with their superiority, the German advance was far from uncontested. Soviet anti-aircraft fire, sporadic sorties from remaining aircraft, and the growing familiarity of Red Army units with German tactics created an environment of constant tension. The Germans could dominate the skies, but they could not erase the Soviets' capacity for adaptive defense on the ground. The human experience of the advance was grueling. Soldiers marched under the summer sun, enduring dust, heat, and the long distances of the southern front. Horses still played a vital role in hauling supplies, revealing the limits of mechanization in a campaign characterized by vast distances and poor infrastructure. Infantrymen carried heavy packs and endured the monotony of open plains, punctuated by sudden violent encounters with entrenched Soviet forces. Letters from the front reveal a mixture of awe and apprehension, or at the scale and power of the Wehrmacht. Apprehension at the endurance required and the possibility of overreach. Encounters with Soviet forces intensified as German units approached the approaches to Stalingrad, while small towns fell quickly under combined artillery and air assault. Larger positions required careful planning and coordination. Soviet units employed flexible defense in-depth tactics, withdrawing strategically to secondary positions while maintaining enough presence to slow German advances. Mines, barricades, and concealed artillery challenged the Wehrmacht at every step. Panzer divisions occasionally succeeded in encircling isolated Soviet units, capturing thousands of prisoners, but the fluid nature of the battlefield meant that complete elimination of enemy forces was rarely achieved. Every victory carried the potential for new vulnerabilities: overextended units, thinly defended flanks, and congested supply routes. Logistical strain began to emerge as a significant factor. Fuel consumption rose sharply with the rapid advance, and supply convoys struggled to maintain pace. With the panzer spearheads, ammunition shortages occasionally forced pauses in the offensive, and mechanical breakdowns required field repairs under difficult conditions. Engineers worked tirelessly to construct and repair bridges, clear minefields, and maintain rail lines, knowing that the army's mobility and the success of the entire campaign depended on their work. The rhythm of the advance was thus a delicate balance between operational tempo and logistical sustainability, a balance that would be tested to its limits in the coming weeks. Meanwhile, Soviet leadership was acutely aware of the strategic importance of Stalingrad. Stalin ordered reinforcements to the region, bolstered existing defensive lines, and instructed local commanders to prepare for urban defense and attritional warfare. The city's industrial areas, rail yards, and riverbanks were fortified to maximize the challenges for the approaching Germans. These preparations signaled a shift in Soviet strategy. Rather than attempting to stop the Wehrmacht in the open steppe, they prepared to absorb the German advance within a densely fortified urban environment, where mechanized advantages could be neutralized. As August progressed, German forces pressed onward, their confidence buoyed by early successes. Yet the further east they moved, the more the complexities of the campaign became apparent. The division of Army Group South, the vast distances over which supplies had to be transported, and the increasing resilience of Soviet defenders all foreshadowed the difficulties ahead. The road to Stalingrad, initially imagined as a straight line of advance, was becoming a labyrinth of tactical challenges, logistical constraints, and human endurance. For observers listening in retrospect, the early stages of the approach to Stalingrad possess a hypnotic rhythm. Columns of tanks and trucks moving across endless plains, coordinated artillery and air support, fleeting encounters with enemy forces, and a steady push toward a city that would soon become the focal point of one of history's most brutal and iconic battles. Momentum, ambition, and miscalculations intertwined, setting the stage for the catastrophic and dramatic events that would define the fate of Case Blue. In the months to come, as August 1942 progressed, the German advance towards Stalingrad intensified and the operational complexities of Case Blue became more pronounced. Army Group E tasked with capturing the city on the Volga found itself at the confluence of ambition, logistical strain, and increasing Soviet resistance. What had begun as a rapid and confident march across the southern plains now revealed the subtle, often invisible forces that would challenge the Wehrmacht assumptions and test the limits of German military planning. The road to Stalingrad was not merely a stretch of open terrain. It was a strategic, psychological, and physical gauntlet that would shape the outcome of the southern campaign. German commanders, initially confident in the momentum generated by the dawn crossings, now faced the delicate task of pacing their forces. Panzer divisions moving ahead of infantry and supply columns created a sense of dynamism, but also introduced vulnerabilities. Flanks became exposed and communication with rear units was increasingly difficult over the vast distances of the steppe. Logistics, always a backbone of any large-scale mechanized operation, began to strain under the combined weight of rapid movement, extended supply lines, and the ongoing maintenance requirements of vehicles and equipment. Fuel shortages, minor as they seemed at first, had the potential to stall armored thrusts at critical moments, while delays in ammunition and rations affected both combat readiness and morale. Soviet defensive measures along the approaches to Stalingrad revealed a growing tactical sophistication. Rather than attempting to hold the open plains outright, Soviet commanders focused on depth defense, trading space for time while inflicting attritional losses on German forces. Villages and small towns became fortified outposts, artillery positions were concealed, and infantry units used natural and urban obstacles to slow the advance. These strategies were designed not merely to resist, but to exhaust the attacker, forcing the Wehrmacht to commit resources over extended periods and distances. Encounters were often sudden and violent. Ambushes in narrow streets, sniper fire from elevated positions, and artillery bombardments from hidden emplacements created a constant environment of stress and attrition for German soldiers. The human dimension of the advance cannot be overstated. Soldiers marched under the oppressive summer heat, their uniforms drenched with sweat, their boots chafing against the endless dust and mud. Horses and vehicles struggled over uneven terrain, while engineers worked tirelessly to repair bridges, clear mines, and restore rail lines critical to sustaining the advance. Infantrymen carried heavy packs, often marching behind armored columns that moved faster than support units could keep pace. Diaries and letters from the front reveal a mixture of awe at the scope of operations and apprehension at the unknown dangers lying ahead. Morale remained high due to initial successes and propaganda emphasizing the inevitability of German victory. Yet fatigue and constant exposure to danger added an undercurrent of tension that would later influence combat effectiveness. Strategic miscalculations became increasingly evident as Army Group B pushed closer to Stalingrad. Hitler's insistence on seizing the city while simultaneously advancing into the Caucasus split forces and diluted combat power. Supply lines stretched to breaking points, and flanking units, often composed of less experienced Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian formations, struggled to hold ground against local counterattacks and partisan activity. These auxiliary units, critical to securing the flanks and freeing German troops for offensive operations, sometimes collapsed under pressure, creating pockets of vulnerability that Soviet commanders were quick to exploit. The operational plan assumed coordination and reliability that in the realities of the Eastern Front were difficult to guarantee. Air support, while still dominant, faced its own limitations. The Luftwaffe had achieved air superiority, but the vast distances, harsh climate, and increasing effectiveness of Soviet anti-aircraft measures meant that German aircraft could not guarantee uninterrupted protection or logistical support. Sorties sometimes failed to neutralize artillery or delay reinforcements, allowing Soviet units to regroup and fortify positions. The dynamic interplay between ground operations and air support required constant attention. Miscommunication or miscalculation could result in stalled advances or unnecessary casualties. The approaching Stalingrad front also highlighted the psychological dimensions of warfare. The city sprawling along the west bank of the Volga was not merely a military objective, but a symbol of Soviet resilience and industrial capacity. Capturing it promised not only strategic control over river transport, but also a symbolic blow against Soviet morale. Conversely, for the defenders, holding Stalingrad became a matter of national pride and political necessity. Both sides understood that the upcoming engagement would have consequences far beyond the immediate tactical environment. As the German columns neared the outskirts of Stalingrad, operational tempo remained high. Yet caution began to emerge in tactical decision-making. Commanders were aware of the risks of overextension, encirclement, and attrition. Every town taken, every river crossed, and every Soviet counterattack revealed the delicate balance between momentum and vulnerability. The faster the Wehrmacht moved, the more dependent it became on flawless logistics and coordination, conditions that were increasingly difficult to maintain across hundreds of kilometers of steppe, rivers, and railways. For a listener immersed in the narrative, the early stages of the approach to Stalingrad possess a hypnotic rhythm. Columns of mechanized units surge across the plains, supported by artillery barges and dive bombers, punctuated by sudden violent engagements with enemy forces. The interplay of ambition, speed, and miscalculation underscores the precarious nature of military operations on a vast and hostile front. Momentum propelled the Wehrmacht forward, but every advance carried the seeds of overreach, foreshadowing the grueling urban battles and logistical crises that would soon engulf the city and define the turning point of Case Blue. The road to Stalingrad was no longer simply a march through the southern steppes. It had become a convergence of strategy, terrain, human endurance, and operational risk. Each day's progress brought the Germans closer to their objective, but simultaneously highlighted the vulnerabilities inherent in Hitler's plan. In this blend of momentum and miscalculation, the campaign reached a critical juncture, setting the stage for one of the most dramatic and consequential battles of the Second World War. Chapter 8: Stalingrad approaches. The encirclement threat grows. By mid-August 1942, the German advance towards Stalingrad had transformed from a fluid southern sweep into a more deliberate, tense operation. As the city itself loomed on the horizon, Army Group B, responsible for the northern and central approaches, began to encounter the full weight of Soviet strategic preparation. Stalingrad was no ordinary target. It was a sprawling industrial hub crisscrossed by rail lines, warehouses, factories, and riverfront installations. Its capture promised control over the Volga, a critical artery for transport and supply in the south, as well as a symbolic victory against the Soviet regime. Yet the closer German units moved to the city, the more apparent became the dangers of overextension, divided forces, and the rising risk of encirclement. The geography of the Volga and the surrounding plains dictated operational choices. Open fields allowed mechanized units to maneuver freely, but the proximity to Stalingrad meant that any advance could be channeled into narrow approaches by fortified urban areas and defensive positions. German panzer divisions surged forward, their speed providing the main advantage. Yet every kilometer gained stretched supply lines further, leaving infantry and support units vulnerable. The tension between momentum and sustainability was palpable. Each successful thrust forward was counterbalanced by the realization that the further the advance, the more tenuous the lines of communication became. Soviet forces under the direction of commanders like General Andrei Yerenko and political overseers in Moscow had adopted a strategy of flexible defense and attritional preparation. Rather than risking massive battles and open terrain, the Red Army reinforced urban perimeters, utilized factories and residential blocks as defensive strongpoints, and prepared to trade space for time. Anti-tank obstacles, trenches, and hidden artillery positions were integrated into the landscape, designed to slow German advances and channel them into areas where counterattacks could be most effective. Every village, railway junction, and river crossing near Stalingrad became a potential choke point, amplifying the threat of encirclement for overextended German units. The operational strain on the German army intensified as August wore on. Army Group B's advance had become increasingly complex due to its distance from supply bases, and the division of Army Group South. Fuel and ammunition had to be moved across hundreds of kilometers, and repair units struggled to keep vehicles operational in the harsh summer conditions. The reliance on extended convoys, often moving through terrain vulnerable to Soviet artillery and partisan disruption, highlighted a persistent vulnerability. The farther the Wehrmacht moved, the more exposed it became to attrition and operational surprises. Every day of success also carried the seed of potential disaster, as isolated spearheads could be surrounded and cut off by determined Soviet countermeasures. Air support continued to be a cornerstone of German operational planning. The Luftwaffe targeted rail networks, artillery positions, and concentrations of Soviet troops, attempting to maintain the momentum of the advance and protect stretched mechanized columns. Stuka dive bombers roared over the plains and riverbanks, turning villages into rubble and suppressing defensive positions. Yet, even with their superiority, the Soviets remained resilient. Anti-aircraft fire, camouflage positions, and the ability to disperse forces effectively meant that German aircraft could not entirely eliminate resistance or prevent Soviet regrouping. The interplay between ground and air forces was increasingly delicate, with mistakes potentially leaving units exposed to counterattacks. The human dimension of the approach to Stalingrad added another layer of complexity. Soldiers marched under oppressive heat, their clothes saturated with sweat, boots worn thin from endless dust and mud, and nerves frayed by constant tension. Infantrymen carried heavy packs behind advancing armored columns, navigating terrain where mechanized units could outpace their support. Engineers labored continuously repairing bridges, clearing mines, and constructing temporary roads to ensure the flow of supplies. Horses, still vital for hauling equipment, struggled over uneven terrain, revealing the limits of mechanization in a campaign defined by distance and infrastructure scarcity. Soldiers' letters and diaries capture a mix of determination and anxiety, reflecting both the thrill of continuous progress and the awareness that every mile gained brought new hazards. Tactical encounters increased in intensity. Soviet units frequently conducted small-scale counterattacks along the approaches, targeting supply convoys, bridging points, and isolated German columns. Mines, barricades, and concealed artillery created a lethal environment, forcing German units to slow their advance and coordinate combined arms operations carefully. In some instances, encirclement of Soviet detachments was successful with thousands captured and temporary corridors of control established. In others, Soviet forces skillfully withdrew to secondary positions, preserving strength for the battles still to come, and further illustrating the growing sophistication of Red Army tactics. By late August, German forces were pressing ever closer to Stalingrad's outskirts. Towns and villages along the river's western bank were captured, bridges repaired or constructed, and supply lines extended. Yet, the operational picture was becoming increasingly fragile. The farther units moved, the more vulnerable they became to encirclement, and the Soviets were well aware of the opportunity to trap isolated elements. The division of forces between Army Group A's push into the Caucasus and Army Group B's focus on Stalingrad created additional risks as reinforcements and support could not be easily shifted without leaving other sectors exposed. For observers following the campaign, the approach to Stalingrad presents a dramatic, almost hypnotic narrative. Armored columns sweeping across the southern steppes, combined arms operations unfolding with precision, and the looming city representing both strategic objective and psychological prize. Yet beneath the surface of apparent momentum, the dangers of overreach, stretched logistics, and resilient Soviet defense are ever present. The risk of encirclement grows with each kilometer, foreshadowing the monumental and devastating urban battles that will define Stalingrad as one of the most consequential theaters of World War E. As August gave way to September 1942, the German advance towards Stalingrad became increasingly perilous. Despite its outward appearance of unstoppable momentum, Army Group E had managed to capture towns, secure key crossing points, and extend its mechanized spearheads. Yet, the realities of overextended supply lines, divided forces, and resilient Soviet defenses were becoming unavoidable. Stalingrad was not simply a city to be seized. It was a crucible, a convergence of geography, industrial infrastructure, and determined human resistance. Every kilometer gained along its approaches highlighted the precariousness of German operations and the looming specter of encirclement. The urbanized approaches to Stalingrad transformed the dynamics of warfare. Unlike the open steppe, which favored speed and maneuver, the areas immediately surrounding the city restricted armored movement and funneled mechanized units into narrow avenues. Villages, rail yards, and industrial installations were fortified by Soviet engineers and garrisoned with infantry, artillery, and anti-tank teams. These defenses created choke points that slowed German columns, forcing coordination between panzers, infantry, engineers, and artillery. The constant negotiation between momentum and caution became the defining feature of the campaign. Push too fast and units risked isolation. Advance too slowly and operational timelines risked collapse. The human cost of this phase was particularly acute. German infantry and engineers moved under relentless sun, negotiating mined roads, rubble-strewn villages, and artillery fire from concealed positions. Supply units struggled to keep pace with fast-moving armored columns, while vehicles broke down under heat, dust, and overuse. Horses, still essential for hauling equipment and supplies, often collapsed under strain. Letters from soldiers describe a sense of tension. Exhilaration at the forward movement contrasted with growing anxiety over the stretched lines, and the unpredictability of the Soviet response. Fatigue, hunger, and the constant threat of ambush became constant companions. Soviet strategy along these approaches showcased both resilience and adaptability. Rather than attempting to hold every inch of open terrain, the Red Army focused on creating layers of defense to attract German forces. And by time for reinforcements to arrive, Small mobile units are as supply columns and flanks, while artillery and sniper teams inflicted steady casualties on advancing units. Mines and barricades disrupted mechanized advances, and engineers repaired destroyed infrastructure to deny the Germans a fully functioning route forward. These tactics exemplified a more sophisticated Soviet approach, one that combined attrition, mobility, and depth, making every gain costly for the WOC. The logistical strain on the German army became increasingly evident. Fuel consumption rose dramatically as panzers advanced far beyond supply bases, and ammunition shortages occasionally forced halts in combat operations. Bridges over rivers damaged either by retreating Soviets or by natural obstacles required continuous repair to maintain the flow of men and material. Engineers and logistics units labored tirelessly, knowing that even a single disrupted supply line could immobilize entire divisions. The farther the Wehrmacht moved, the more reliant it became on flawless coordination and timing, a requirement that grew ever more difficult as the campaign expanded across hundreds of kilometers of hostile terrain. Air support remained a critical factor in maintaining German momentum. Stuka dive bombers and fighter aircraft struck enemy positions, rail lines, and supply depots, aiming to suppress Soviet resistance and provide cover for advancing ground units. Yet the Soviets, increasingly adept at camouflage and dispersal, mitigated the effectiveness of air attacks. Anti-aircraft fire from concealed positions and sporadic sorties from remaining Soviet aircraft challenged the Luftwaffe's supremacy. The delicate interplay between air and ground operations underscored the increasing complexity of the campaign. Even a slight miscalculation could leave columns vulnerable to ambush, artillery, or counterattack. Encirclement threats were no longer theoretical. As German units advanced closer to Stalingrad, their extended lines and dispersed formations created openings that Soviet commanders were eager to exploit. Any isolated column could be surrounded, cut off from reinforcements, and subjected to concentrated artillery and infantry attacks. Panzer spearheads, while powerful, were particularly susceptible if they outpaced infantry and logistical support. The operational risk inherent in rapid advance became increasingly visible, foreshadowing the catastrophic encirclements that would later define the Battle of Stalingrad. The psychological dimension of the approaching city was profound. Stalingrad was more than a military objective. It symbolized Soviet industrial power, national resolve, and the ability to resist the German war machine. For German commanders and soldiers, capturing the city promised strategic advantage and personal glory. Yet, it also carried the implicit warning of a prolonged urbanized struggle that could neutralize mechanized superiority. For the Soviets, holding Stalingrad was both a strategic necessity and a matter of political survival. This tension set the stage for one of the most dramatic confrontations of the Eastern Front, where strategy, endurance, and urban warfare would intersect in unprecedented ways. By early September, the German advance was at a critical juncture. Bridgeheads were established, towns were captured, and forward positions were secured. Yet supply lines were stretched dangerously thin. Flanks were weakly held by Allied Axis forces, and Soviet resistance was growing more organized and ferocious. Every operational decision carried immediate tactical consequences and potential strategic repercussions. The encirclement threat, once distant, now hovered palpably over the advancing Wehrmacht, shaping their actions, cautioning against overreach, and foreshadowing the horrors to come in the heart of Stalingrad itself. The narrative of these final approaches possesses a hypnotic quality. Armored columns advancing relentlessly, combined arms operations unfolding with meticulous coordination, and the looming city signaling both opportunity and danger. Every victory, every town captured comes with a shadow, the possibility that the very momentum of success could become the precursor to entrapment, exhaustion, and ultimate reversal. In these tense days, the interplay between ambition, endurance, and operational risk crystallizes, setting the stage for the epic confrontation that would define the turning point of Case Blue and the Second World War. Chapter 9, Stalingrad encircled. First clashes and urban warfare. By September 1942, German forces had reached the outskirts of Stalingrad, and the first serious clashes within the city began to define the brutal character of urban warfare. Army Group B's advance, though initially rapid, had slowed as the Wareham encountered the full weight of Soviet defensive preparation. Stalingrad was no longer merely a strategic objective on a map. It had become a maze of streets, factories, and riverfront installations where every building could conceal artillery, snipers, and infantry. The city's industrial infrastructure and residential quarters became defensive bastions, turning a conventional advance into a nightmare of attrition and close-quarters combat. German planners had assumed that speed and superior firepower would continue to ensure victory, but the urban terrain exposed the limitations of mechanized and armored warfare. Tanks which had dominated open plains now struggled to maneuver in narrow streets, debris-strewn avenues, and rubble from initial bombardments. Infantry units were forced to clear buildings one floor at a time, often facing ambushes, hidden machine gun nests, and sniper fire. Every gain cost time, casualties, and exhaustion. Soldiers who had previously moved across the steppe with confidence now confronted the unpredictable and lethal complexity of city fighting, where progress was measured in meters rather than km. The Soviets had prepared the city for a defense-in-depth approach. Industrial complexes, such as the tractor factory, grain elevators, and steel mills were fortified with artillery positioned to cover streets and open squares. Snipers concealed and ruined buildings inflicted steady casualties on German units, while engineers reinforced barricades and constructed obstacles designed to channel armored movements into kill zones. Soviet urban defense emphasized attrition and disorientation. The Wehrmacht could advance, but at a cost that grew exponentially with each block captured. The initial German belief in rapid victory within the city was challenged daily. As small-scale engagements expanded into protracted fights that drained resources and morale. The human experience of these early urban battles was grueling. Infantrymen carried heavy packs, weapons, and ammunition through streets lined with rubble and debris, while artillery and tank crews struggled to navigate constricted avenues, under constant threat of ambush. Exhaustion compounded the danger. Soldiers were required to remain alert for hours, often with limited food, water, and sleep. Letters from the front describe a surreal mixture of tension and determination. The thrill of entering the city intertwined with the horror of sudden explosions, sniper fire, and the unpredictable hazards of street combat. Each step forward demanded coordination, courage, and resilience as the urban battlefield turned into a test of endurance as much as tactical skill. Air support, while still operational, faced its limitations in the urban environment. Stuka dive bombers and fighter aircraft could strike industrial complexes and open areas, but dense building structures limited their effectiveness and increased the risk of friendly fire. Artillery units, too, faced challenges. Shells often destroyed streets and buildings indiscriminately, creating obstacles for advancing German forces and complicating coordination between units. The balance between destruction and progress became a constant concern, as commanders sought to maintain momentum while avoiding overexposure to counterattacks. Soviet defensive tactics increasingly emphasized small unit initiative. Red Army squads, often isolated from larger formations, operated autonomously within neighborhoods, using knowledge of the terrain to outmaneuver German forces. Mines, improvised explosives, and hidden snipers were employed to slow armored columns and disrupt infantry advances. Even when outgunned, these units could inflict disproportionate casualties and delay the Wehrmacht's timetable. The resilience of these defenders forced German commanders to adapt continually, balancing the desire for rapid capture with the necessity of maintaining unit cohesion and minimizing losses. The first encirclement threats began to emerge at this stage. While German forces had established positions within the city, flanking units were thinly spread and vulnerable to counterattacks from Soviet reserves. or guerrilla-style operations. The urban environment magnified this risk. The narrow streets and barricaded avenues prevented rapid redeployment, making units susceptible to being isolated. Encirclement, once a theoretical concern in the open steppe, became a tangible operational hazard, foreshadowing the cataclysmic entrapments that would later define the Battle of Stalingrad. The psychological dimension of the battle intensified within Stalingrad. Soldiers experienced a mixture of exhilaration, fear, and mounting tension. Capturing territory in the city offered the promise of progress, yet each street gained seemed to reveal new dangers and unforeseen resistance. The urban battlefield became a microcosm of the larger war. Strategy, endurance, human ingenuity, and sheer willpower collided in every firefight, ambush, and artillery strike. For the German army, victory was no longer a matter of rapid advance. It had become a brutal grinding test of resources, morale, and adaptability. By late September, the Wehrmacht had secured initial positions within Stalingrad's outskirts, but the pace of advance had slowed dramatically. Each street, factory, and residential block required careful clearing, coordination, and reinforcement. The initial euphoria of rapid movement gave way to the sobering reality of attritional urban warfare. Encirclement threats, logistical challenges, and the relentless resilience of Soviet defenders coalesced into a strategic environment that would test the limits of German operational planning and soldierly endurance. For observers and future historians, these early urban engagements provide a vivid portrait of the realities of Stalingrad, the interplay of momentum and vulnerability, the deadly precision of urban defense, and the physical and psychological toll on combatants. The Wehrmacht, once confident in its ability to seize objectives quickly, was now embroiled in a struggle where every gain demanded immense sacrifice. These first clashes within the city would set the tone for months of brutal combat, defining both the character of Stalingrad and the trajectory of Case Blue. As it moved toward its fateful conclusion, as September 1942 progressed, the fighting in Stalingrad intensified and the German advance, once swift and confident, became bogged down in the unforgiving reality of urban warfare. Army Group B, though holding initial positions along the western banks of the Volga, faced a battlefield that was as psychologically exhausting as it was physically demanding. The city had transformed into a labyrinth of streets, factories, and debris, where every building could conceal artillery, snipers, or ambushing infantry. The Germans were learning that the methods, which had allowed rapid advancement across the steppes, were often ineffective in the claustrophobic, unpredictable environment of the city. The nature of urban combat meant that progress was painstakingly slow. Infantry units were forced to clear buildings one room at a time, and every engagement could produce high casualties. Tanks, essential for breakthroughs in open terrain, were vulnerable in streets blocked by rubble or barricades, where anti-tank teams could attack from concealed positions. Engineers worked constantly to clear obstacles, bridge small canals, and restore passageways, often under heavy fire. German commanders faced the challenge of maintaining momentum while minimizing losses, but the city's layout and Soviet defensive preparation made both objectives increasingly difficult. Soviet forces, fully aware of the city's strategic and symbolic value, employed innovative tactics to exploit German weaknesses. Red Army units operated in small mobile groups, capable of striking and then disappearing into ruins, or riverfront fortifications. Mines, improvised explosive devices, and sniper positions slowed armored and infantry advances, while artillery embedded in factories or tall buildings created lethal zones that German units had to navigate cautiously. This flexible defense allowed the Soviets to inflict significant attritional damage, slowing the German timetable and forcing the Wehrmacht to commit disproportionate resources to small areas. The human experience of the battle was intense. Infantrymen exhausted by weeks of campaigning now faced a city in flames, where every corner could hide danger. Civilians caught in the crossfire added a tragic dimension, while soldiers wrote of the surreal combination of destruction, noise, and fear. Sleep was scarce, rations were limited, and the physical toll on both men and animals was extreme. Letters from German troops described the shock of entering urban combat. After months of open field maneuvering, the chaos, uncertainty, and unpredictability of Stalingrad created a sense of claustrophobia and constant vigilance. Air support, though still operational, faced unique challenges. The dense urban environment limited the effectiveness of dive bombers and fighter bombers, as collateral damage risked impeding German movement. Artillery, while essential for reducing fortified buildings, often created rubble that blocked streets and complicated logistics. Commanders had to balance destructive firepower with tactical progress, a delicate act requiring careful coordination and judgment. Mistakes could leave units exposed or stall entire sections of the advance. The first serious encirclement threats began to manifest. German forces operating on multiple axes and overextended supply lines became increasingly vulnerable to flanking and infiltration by Soviet units. The narrow streets, debris-laden avenues, and fortified positions within the city amplified these risks. Even small Soviet counterattacks could isolate German units, and the potential for entrapment became a constant operational concern. The Wehrmacht's logistical fragility, stretched over long distances and dependent on vulnerable supply lines, further compounded the risk. Tactical lessons were learned quickly, though often at a high cost. Urban warfare required close cooperation between infantry, engineers, artillery, and armor, as well as constant vigilance for hidden dangers. German units discovered that the speed and shock tactics effective in the steppe were often neutralized in the city. Every engagement demanded adaptation, creativity, and resilience, highlighting the skill and endurance of both attackers and defenders. The Red Army, operating with local knowledge and fortified positions, imposed a grinding pace that contrasted sharply with the rapid maneuvering of earlier campaigns. Psychologically, Stalingrad imposed a unique strain. Soldiers had to reconcile the promise of advance with the reality of constant danger, casualties, and fatigue. Commanders faced decisions that balanced potential gains against the risk of entrapment or logistical collapse. The city itself, a sprawling industrial hub, became a character in the campaign, an obstacle, a weapon, and a stage for the endurance and willpower of combatants. Both German and Soviet forces recognized that the outcome of the struggle here would have strategic, operational, and symbolic consequences far beyond the immediate battlefield. To be by the end of September, initial German gains in Stalingrad were consolidated, yet the pace of advance remained painstakingly slow. Each street, factory, and residential block required careful clearing, while supply lines struggled to keep pace. Encirclement threats, attritional resistance, and the complex urban environment ensured that the battle was only beginning. The city's maze of ruins and industrial complexes foreshadowed the protracted and devastating conflict that would define Stalingrad, a campaign where strategy, endurance, human ingenuity, and sheer willpower would collide in unprecedented ways. For observers, the early urban fighting in Stalingrad illustrates the brutal transformation of a once open campaign into a grinding, destructive struggle. The combination of tactical adaptation, logistical strain, and human resilience underscores the complexity of Case Blue at its most critical juncture. The Wehrmacht, confident in its operational prowess, was confronted with the reality that urban warfare, the threat of encirclement, and the steadfast Soviet defense would challenge every assumption about speed, dominance, and victory. Chapter 10: Stalingrad's Heart. Fierce resistance and attritional warfare. By early October 1942, the German advance into Stalingrad had transformed from a campaign of rapid maneuver into a grinding struggle of attrition. Army Group E, which had initially envisioned a swift capture of the city along the Volga, now confronted the harsh realities of urban combat, logistical strain, and the unrelenting resilience of Soviet defenders. The streets, factories, and residential blocks of Stalingrad had become a maze where every building could hide artillery, machine guns, or sniper positions. Each step forward was measured in meters, and each engagement exacted a heavy toll on soldiers, vehicles, and morale. The Wehrmacht had underestimated the scale and intensity of the Soviet urban defense. Red Army commanders had prepared the city meticulously, converting industrial complexes into fortresses and reinforcing residential areas with barricades and defensive positions. Factories, such as the Red October steel mill, the tractor plant, and the grain silos were fortified with interconnected bunkers, trenches, and artillery emplacements. These positions allowed Soviet troops to absorb initial German attacks, regroup, and launch counter-assaults. Every advance by German units became a costly endeavor, with infantry and armor forced into close-quarter combat under constant fire. German panzer divisions, previously dominant across open terrain, faced severe limitations in the city. Narrow streets, collapsed buildings, and debris-strewn avenues restricted maneuverability, while concealed anti-tank weapons inflicted continuous damage. Tanks became both a support tool and a liability, requiring infantry to clear the surrounding area before they could advance safely. Engineers labored under constant threat to repair streets, clear rubble, and construct temporary bridges across damaged canals and rubble-filled thoroughfares. Coordination between infantry, armor, and artillery was essential, but difficult to maintain under these chaotic conditions. The psychological toll on soldiers was immense. Infantrymen already exhausted from months of campaigning across the southern steppes now had to endure constant stress in a hostile urban environment. Sniper fire, artillery strikes from hidden positions, and ambushes in narrow streets created an atmosphere of perpetual danger. Soldiers' letters and diaries describe surreal scenes. Once ordinary streets reduced to death traps, the echo of explosions through factory halls, and the tension of moving meter by meter under enemy fire. Despite propaganda emphasizing inevitability of victory, fatigue, fear, and uncertainty gnawed at morale, forcing commanders to constantly motivate and reinforce units. Soviet tactics emphasized attritional warfare and small unit initiative. Squads operated autonomously within neighborhoods, using knowledge of terrain to harass German supply lines, isolate forward units, and strike armored columns. Mines and improvised explosive devices slowed movement, while machine guns and snipers forced German units to proceed cautiously. This decentralized adaptive defense inflicted steady casualties and disrupted German plans, demonstrating a growing operational sophistication that contrasted sharply with the open field battles of the previous year. Urban warfare had become a battle of endurance, patience, and ingenuity. Logistical strain intensified the challenges of attritional warfare. Supply lines already stretched across hundreds of kilometers of steppe, and rivers had to navigate the ruins and barricaded streets of Stalingrad. Ammunition shortages occasionally forced temporary halts in attacks, while fuel limitations affected armored units' mobility. Engineers and logistics teams worked tirelessly to maintain vehicle functionality, repair roads, and ensure the flow of provisions to frontline units. Even small disruptions, destroyed bridges, congested streets, or delayed convoys had the potential to stall operations and expose forward units to counterattacks. The Wehrmacht's operational tempo, once a source of strength, became increasingly fragile under the weight of attritional demands. Air support, while still dominant, faced new challenges in the urban environment. Dive bombers and fighter aircraft could strike large industrial complexes and open areas, but risked creating rubble that hindered ground operations or caused friendly fire incidents. Anti-aircraft fire from concealed positions limited air superiority in critical areas, and the dispersal of Soviet units complicated targeting. Coordination between air, artillery, and ground units became increasingly complex, with mistakes potentially leaving troops exposed or delaying advances. Each day of fighting required meticulous planning to maintain even modest progress. Soviet reinforcements arriving via the Volga added pressure to German operations. The river served as a lifeline for personnel, equipment, and supplies, allowing the defenders to rotate units, sustain morale, and replace losses. These reinforcements arrived often under cover of darkness or during German air lulls, ensuring that the defenders remained resilient despite heavy casualties. The continuous flow of men and material prevented the Wehrmacht from achieving decisive breakthroughs, emphasizing the strategic importance of logistics and the river's role in the defense. Encirclement threats loomed larger as the Wehrmacht pushed deeper into the city. Isolated forward units faced the danger of being surrounded by Soviet counterattacks, urban ambushes, or coordinated flanking maneuvers. Every street and factory became a potential trap, where superior firepower could be neutralized by terrain and determined defense. The Germans were beginning to realize that Stalingrad was not merely a tactical objective, but a strategic quagmire where the very act of advance carried profound risk. By mid-October, German forces had secured key industrial areas and some residential sectors, but progress was slow and costly. Streets were littered with debris, tanks were immobilized, and infantry units were exhausted. The psychological impact on soldiers was profound. Each victory was tempered by casualties, logistical challenges, and the constant awareness of encirclement risk. Stalingrad had become a crucible of attrition where the interplay of urban terrain, determined defense, and human endurance would define the trajectory of Case Blue. The early stages of Stalingrad's urban fighting illustrate a campaign transformed by environment, strategy, and resilience. The Wehrmacht, accustomed to rapid, decisive maneuver, now faced a grinding struggle where each meter gained required meticulous planning, coordination and sacrifice, attritional warfare, small unit initiative, logistical strain, and the threat of encirclement combined to make Stalingrad one of the most challenging and consequential battles of World War II. The stage was set for months of relentless combat, where victory would demand not only firepower, but endurance, ingenuity, and the will to endure one of history's most brutal urban conflicts. As October 1942 progressed deeper into the heart of Stalingrad, the German advance slowed to a grueling crawl. Army Group B, once confident in the speed and decisiveness of its maneuver warfare, found itself entrenched in a struggle that taxed not only material resources, but human endurance to the utmost limits. Stalingrad was no longer just a city. It had become a labyrinth of rubble, fortified factories, and winding streets where every building and alley concealed danger. For the Wehrmacht, every day brought fierce combat, escalating casualties, and the sobering realization that urban warfare had its own brutal logic, one that neutralized many of the advantages enjoyed on the open steppe. The industrial districts of Stalingrad became central to both the German and Soviet strategies. The Red October steelworks, tractor factories, and ammunition depots had been transformed into near-impenetrable fortresses, fortified with trenches, barricades, and interline firing positions. Soviet engineers utilized every structure and material at their disposal to create defensive layers that funneled German forces into kill zones. Artillery and machine guns covered the avenues of advance, while snipers and small unit patrols targeted exposed soldiers, disrupting both movement and morale. Every captured block required hours of intense combat and left German units exhausted and vulnerable. German panzer divisions, which had previously been decisive in open field engagements, now encountered severe constraints. Narrow streets and debris-filled roads reduced maneuverability, while anti-tank weapons embedded in buildings or hidden among rubble inflicted continuous attritional damage. Infantry had to clear buildings floor by floor, often under heavy fire, to allow tanks to advance safely. Engineers worked tirelessly to clear mines, repair collapsed streets, and maintain bridges under enemy observation and bombardment. The need for coordination between infantry, armor, artillery, and engineers was constant, and even minor miscalculations could result in heavy losses or stalled operations. The psychological strain on German soldiers intensified with every passing day. Infantrymen already fatigued from weeks of campaigning now faced relentless close-quarters combat, constant threat from snipers, and the suffocating intensity of urban fighting. Nights offered little respite. The city was a maze of shadows, rubble, and hidden dangers where sudden ambushes or artillery strikes could be deadly. Letters and diaries reveal a mixture of dread and determination, as soldiers grappled with the reality that progress came at enormous human cost. The city, its streets destroyed and factories transformed into fortresses, imposed a relentless mental and physical toll, testing courage, endurance, and cohesion. Soviet defensive strategy emphasized resilience and attrition. Small autonomous units operated across neighborhoods, disrupting German supply lines, ambushing isolated columns and launching counterattacks that struck unpredictably. Mines and improvised explosive devices slowed mechanized movement, while machine gun nests and snipers forced constant vigilance. The Red Army's flexible approach maximized the impact of limited resources, demonstrating operational sophistication and turning each German gain into a costly endeavor. Stalingrad's urban terrain amplified these effects, neutralizing some of the Weremich's technological and tactical advantages. Logistics became an even more critical concern. Fuel, ammunition, and rations had to traverse streets blocked by rubble, destroyed bridges, and ongoing combat. Supply convoys were vulnerable to ambush, artillery fire, and partisan activity, creating constant pressure on both forward units and rear echelon operations. Vehicles broke down under strain, and engineers faced the unending task of maintaining roads, bridges, and routes for armored units. Each delay or disruption compounded operational risks, leaving forward elements exposed to counterattacks and threatening the momentum necessary for eventual victory. Air support, while still operational, had diminished relative impact. Dive bombers and fighter aircraft could target open areas or industrial complexes, but dense urban structures reduced effectiveness and increased the risk of friendly fire incidents. Anti-aircraft fire from concealed Soviet positions and the dispersal of units complicated air operations. Ground commanders had to constantly balance destructive bombardments with tactical advancement, ensuring that heavy firepower did not inadvertently hinder their own progress. Encirclement risk became increasingly tangible. German units, often dispersed across multiple axes of advance, could be isolated by Soviet counterattacks or flanking maneuvers. The narrow streets, rubble-filled avenues, and fortified buildings magnified these dangers. Any misstep could allow Soviet forces to trap small units, cutting them off from reinforcements and supplies. The urban battlefield combined with extended supply lines underscored the vulnerability of even elite formations in such a constricted and contested space. By the end of October, German forces had gained control of some industrial sectors and a few residential blocks. Yet the fighting remained intensely attritional. Streets were littered with rubble. Artillery shells had destroyed buildings that now blocked passageways, and infantry units were fatigued and strained. The city had become a crucible where strategy, endurance, and human resilience collided. Each day's progress was a testament to meticulous planning, bravery, and adaptability. Yet, it was also a reminder of the immense cost of urban warfare. Stalingrad's heart had revealed itself as a battlefield where momentum could no longer guarantee success, and where the combination of terrain, defense, and human resilience created one of the most grueling combat environments of the Second World War. German forces accustomed to decisive maneuvers and rapid advances now confronted a campaign defined by attrition, uncertainty, and the ever-present risk of encirclement. The battle would continue to escalate in ferocity, shaping the trajectory of Case Blue and setting the stage for one of history's most iconic and devastating military confrontations. Chapter 11. The Turning Tide. Soviet counter-offensives and German strain. By November 1942, the Wehrmacht's grip on Stalingrad, though firm in certain industrial districts, began to reveal the limits of German operational planning and the enduring resilience of Soviet forces. Army Group E had achieved some tactical gains, capturing portions of the Red October steelworks, the grain silos, and residential neighborhoods along the western Volga. Yet even as German commanders celebrated minor victories, the strategic situation was becoming increasingly precarious. Extended supply lines overtaxed units and the emergence of Soviet counter-offensives foreshadowed a transformation in the battle, a turning tide that would ultimately redefine the fate of Case Blue. The German advance, once rapid and confident, now operated under severe constraints. Infantry and armored units were scattered across a patchwork of urban and industrial sectors, their positions interspersed with rubble, barricades, and fortified enemy strongpoints. Streets that had once offered avenues for maneuver were now choke points lined with anti-tank weapons, mines, and snipers. Engineers labored tirelessly to clear debris and repair roads, while artillery units attempted to suppress fortified positions. Despite their training and coordination, German forces faced a grinding reality. Every meter gained was costly, and the tempo of operations could not be maintained without placing units at risk. The human dimension of this period was particularly harrowing. Soldiers endured freezing November temperatures with scant provisions, limited medical care, and minimal respite from continuous combat. Infantrymen already fatigued from months of relentless operations were required to clear buildings, engage in street firefights, and maintain vigilance against sudden ambushes. Letters from the front described the surreal combination of destruction, exhaustion, and tension. Soldiers faced the dual burden of physical danger and psychological strain. Each advance brought victory, yet also revealed the growing threat of encirclement and attrition. Soviet forces under the strategic oversight of Generals Yerenko and Chukov had begun to transition from defensive attrition to active counter-offensives. Small units reinforced by riverborne reinforcements from the eastern bank of the Volga launched attacks against German flanks, supply convoys, and isolated forward positions. Urban terrain favored these operations. Narrow streets, factory complexes, and fortified neighborhoods allowed smaller, highly mobile Soviet detachments to strike effectively against numerically superior, but dispersed German formations. Mines, improvised explosives, and hidden artillery positions further amplified the lethality of these counterattacks. Logistical strain increasingly dictated operational possibilities. German supply lines stretched across hundreds of kilometers from depots in the Don region to the front lines within Stalingrad. Harsh winter weather, constant Soviet harassment, and damaged infrastructure exacerbated shortages of fuel, ammunition, and food. Forward units, particularly those advancing into the heart of the city, were vulnerable to disruption, and minor delays could have disproportionate tactical consequences. Even elite panzer divisions were constrained by limited fuel and repair capacity, highlighting the vulnerability of mechanized forces in prolonged urban engagements. Air operations, a cornerstone of German strategy, faced new limitations. Dense urban terrain reduced the effectiveness of bombing runs, while Soviet anti-aircraft fire and intermittent sorties challenged Luftwaffe dominance. Precision strikes were difficult in areas where industrial and residential zones were closely intertwined. Additionally, the Soviets had learned to disperse resources and personnel, mitigating the impact of aerial bombardment. The interplay between air support and ground operations became increasingly delicate, with any lapse risking casualties or the stalling of forward momentum. The psychological and strategic importance of Stalingrad intensified the stakes for both sides. For the Germans, capturing the city meant securing control over the Volga, cutting Soviet supply lines, and striking a symbolic blow against the Soviet Union. For the Soviets, retaining Stalingrad was a matter of survival and national morale. Stalin's insistence on holding the city at all costs meant that reinforcements, supplies, and reserves continued to flow across the river, maintaining the resilience of defenders despite heavy casualties. The Volga, acting as both lifeline and barrier, allowed the Soviets to absorb German pressure and prepare for counter-offensive operations. By mid-November, Soviet forces had begun to execute more coordinated counterattacks in sectors where German positions were overextended. Infantry, artillery, and armored units converged on weak points, often striking isolated units and supply depots. The combination of terrain, intelligence, and local initiative allowed these operations to have an outsized impact relative to their scale. German commanders faced the growing realization that momentum alone could no longer secure objectives, and that attritional losses combined with strategic overreach could imperil entire sectors of army group. Its encirclement risk became a tangible threat. German units within the city were advancing into areas where Soviet reserves reinforced via the Volga could potentially isolate forward positions. Supply disruptions and flanking attacks heightened this danger. While German morale remained relatively high due to propaganda and initial victories, the strategic picture was increasingly ominous. Units in the industrial heart of Stalingrad were now operating within a complex web of danger, where the potential for entrapment and catastrophic losses was no longer abstract, but imminent. The early stages of Soviet counter-offensives in November illustrate a critical shift. In the Battle of Stalingrad, momentum which had favored the Wehrmacht in prior months was giving way to calculated resistance and strategic adaptation. Urban terrain, logistical vulnerability, and persistent counterattacks combined to erode German operational effectiveness. For the first time, the narrative of Case Blue showed cracks. The advancing Wehrmacht, previously a symbol of invincibility, was now confronted with the possibility that the battle could turn decisively against them. That I end these tense days. The interplay of strategy, endurance, and attrition underscored the evolving complexity of the Stalingrad theater. German forces, initially confident in rapid urban conquest, now had to navigate an environment where every tactical decision carried potential strategic consequences. The stage was being set for the pivotal developments that would define the turning tide. As Soviet resilience, preparation, and counter-offensive operations began to challenge the Wehrmacht's ability to maintain control of the city. As November 1942 deepened, the first tangible signs of a turning tide in Stalingrad became undeniable. The Wehrmacht, once confident in its advance across southern Russia, found itself increasingly constrained by logistical difficulties, overextended lines, and a Soviet defense that had shifted from attritional persistence to active counter-offensive operations. Army Group B's units scattered across industrial sectors and residential neighborhoods faced constant pressure on multiple fronts. Every gain made within the city came at a heavy cost in manpower, resources, and morale. The relentless urban struggle revealed that the initial assumptions of Case Blue, speed, maneuver, and superior firepower were being challenged by the harsh realities of terrain, weather, and a determined enemy. The Soviet counter-offensives were carefully coordinated and exploited every advantage offered by the city's terrain. Small, highly mobile units struck at weakly held positions, supply lines, and isolated forward detachments. Streets, canals, and rubble-filled avenues allowed defenders to ambush German forces with deadly effect. Mines, improvised explosives, and sniper fire slowed armored columns, forcing infantry to proceed cautiously and often at a crawl. Artillery placed in fortified factories or elevated buildings rained destruction on German positions, while reinforcements crossing the Volga ensured that resistance remained strong. These counterattacks disrupted momentum, inflicted steady casualties, and forced German commanders to constantly adapt their operational plans. The strain on German logistics became increasingly acute. Fuel, ammunition, and provisions had to navigate destroyed streets, blocked avenues, and intermittent Soviet attacks. Supply convoys faced constant risk of ambush, artillery fire, or obstruction, which could immobilize forward units for hours or even days. Even minor disruptions compounded operational risks, leaving German soldiers exposed to sustained attacks and reducing the effectiveness of armored support. Engineers worked tirelessly to repair bridges, clear rubble, and maintain streets, but their efforts could never fully offset the challenges posed by an urban battlefield. Under constant fire, air support, though still dominant in many sectors, faced limitations in the dense urban environment. Dive bombers could strike open areas and industrial targets, but narrow streets and tightly clustered buildings reduced the impact of bombardment and increased the risk of civilian and friendly casualties. Anti-aircraft fire from concealed Soviet positions and the ability to disperse units mitigated the low offer's effectiveness. Coordination between air and ground forces required meticulous planning with minor errors, potentially leaving infantry or armored units exposed at critical moments. The psychological impact of this constant aerial threat, coupled with the danger of urban ambushes, intensified the stress on German soldiers. Soviet reinforcements continued to arrive across the Volga, providing fresh manpower, artillery support, and supplies to embattled defenders. The river served as a lifeline, allowing the Red Army to sustain a level of resistance that would have been impossible without external reinforcement. These units rotated into the front lines, bolstering defense, launching localized counterattacks, and maintaining the momentum of attritional resistance. The ability of Soviet commanders to integrate these reinforcements effectively highlighted their growing operational sophistication and foreshadowed the encirclement maneuvers that would soon threaten the entire German force. The threat of encirclement became increasingly pronounced. German forces advancing into complex urban terrain and spread across extended sectors risked isolation if Soviet units could exploit gaps or weakly held flanks. Supply disruptions, overextended positions, and the relentless pressure of urban combat meant that even elite divisions could be cut off. The encirclement threat was no longer hypothetical. It was an operational reality, forcing German commanders to reconsider the feasibility of their objectives and the security of their lines. Every tactical decision carried strategic consequences. The human dimension of this period cannot be overstated. Soldiers endured freezing temperatures, limited rations, and constant threat from artillery, snipers, and ambushes. Fatigue, stress, and exposure compounded physical danger, while the psychological strain of urban combat, where death could emerge around every corner, tested morale to its limits. Letters and diaries from the front reveal a mix of determination, fear, and grim acceptance. Soldiers understood that their gains were temporary, vulnerable to counterattack, and that each step forward deepened the risk of entrapment. By late November, the momentum of German operations had clearly stalled in key sectors, while certain industrial and residential areas remained under German control. The pace of advance had slowed, casualties were mounting, and supply lines were stretched dangerously thin. Soviet counter-offensives had inflicted significant damage, disrupted coordination, and exposed vulnerabilities in the Wehrmacht positions. Army Group B, despite its initial successes, now faced a campaign environment where attrition, logistical strain, and the threat of encirclement outweighed the advantages of superior firepower and training. The turning tide of Stalingrad illustrates the dynamic interplay of strategy, terrain, and human endurance. German forces, once confident in rapid conquest, now confronted the harsh realities of a city where momentum could not guarantee victory. Soviet resilience, reinforced by reinforcements and adaptive tactics, had begun to reshape the operational landscape. Encirclement, attritional pressure, and urban complexity signaled that the Wehrmacht's ambitions were increasingly at risk. The stage was set for the decisive developments that would determine the outcome of Case Blue and the fate of the German forces in Stalingrad. Chapter 12, Operation Uranus. Encirclement begins as November 1942 drew to a close. The German positions in Stalingrad, though holding key industrial districts and residential blocks, were increasingly precarious. Army Group B's units were deeply entrenched within the city, facing not only relentless urban resistance, but the ever-growing strain of stretched supply lines, fatigue, and the chilling onset of winter. Unbeknownst to many of the German commanders, The Soviet High Command had been meticulously preparing a massive counter-offensive design to exploit these vulnerabilities, an operation that would further change the course of Case Blue. This counter-offensive, named Operation Uranus, was poised to encircle and trap the German Sixth Army within Stalingrad, turning the hunter into the hunted. Operation Uranus was the result of careful strategic planning by the Soviets, recognizing that German forces were heavily committed within the city, and that their flanks were largely defended by weaker Axis allies. Soviet planners identified a unique opportunity. Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian units tasked with guarding the northern and southern flanks of Army Group B were thinly manned, poorly equipped, and stretched over long frontages. These units, though loyal allies of Germany, were insufficient to withstand a concentrated Soviet attack. The Soviets intended to strike both flanks simultaneously, encircle the Sixth Army, and sever all lines of communication and supply into Stalingrad. The scale of Operation Uranus was staggering. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops reinforced with armor, artillery, and logistics units prepared to advance in a coordinated double envelopment. The northern pincer, composed largely of the Dawn Front, would strike southward toward Kalik, aiming to link up with forces advancing from the south. Simultaneously, the southern pincer from the Stalingrad front would move northward, across the open steppe to complete the encirclement. The timing was crucial. Both pincers needed to advance quickly and in unison to prevent German reserves from stabilizing the flanks. The Soviets meticulously rehearsed their plan, ensuring communication, timing, and coordination between units, with deception measures implemented to mislead German intelligence. On the German side, command underestimated both the scale and immediacy of the Soviet preparations. Hitler, confident in the Sixth Army's ability to hold its ground and in the presumed superiority of German tactics, dismissed repeated warnings about the vulnerability of the flanks. German intelligence failed to detect the concentration of Soviet forces, while Axis allies were left inadequately reinforced and poorly supplied. The Sixth Army, deeply entrenched within Stalingrad, was focused on urban combat, often unaware of the massive maneuvering happening just beyond the immediate front lines. The disparity between the German perception and the Soviet reality set the stage for one of the most dramatic encirclements in military history. That as the operation commenced in late November, the initial Soviet assaults hit the flanks with devastating effectiveness. The Romanian armies, equipped with outdated weapons and lacking sufficient anti-tank defenses, were quickly overwhelmed. Soviet armored columns surged through weak points, breaking the front lines and exploiting gaps that the Germans had assumed were secure. German attempts to reinforce these sectors were hampered by distance, logistical constraints, and the speed of the Soviet advance. Within hours, entire Axis divisions were in retreat or being encircled as the Soviets pressed their momentum relentlessly. The human dimension of the encirclement was dramatic and harrowing. German and Axis troops on the flanks, realizing that they were facing overwhelming odds, attempted desperate withdrawals under continuous Soviet fire. Cold, exhaustion, and confusion exacerbated losses. Vehicles broke down, artillery units were abandoned, and thousands of soldiers were cut off from retreat routes. Reports from the front described scenes of chaos, columns of retreating men interspersed with burning vehicles, artillery shells impacting roads and fields, and the eerie quiet between the ferocious bursts of combat. The Wehrmacht, long accustomed to tactical superiority, found itself vulnerable to encirclement and the loss of operational initiative. Meanwhile, within Stalingrad, the soldiers of the Sixth Army remained largely unaware of the catastrophe unfolding on their flanks. Infantry continued to clear buildings, factories, and residential blocks, pressing into the urban maze with heavy casualties. Commanders were preoccupied with tactical considerations inside the city, unaware that Soviet pincers were closing in, ready to trap the entire army. The contrast between German activity inside Stalingrad and the dramatic developments on the periphery created a deadly disconnect, illustrating the operational complexity of large-scale warfare. The psychological impact of Operation Uranus was profound. Soviet forces were imbued with determination, reinforced by meticulous planning and high stakes, while German troops, when aware of the encirclement, faced a harrowing combination of shock, disbelief, and growing desperation. For soldiers within Stalingrad, the realization that their supply lines and communication could be severed created anxiety, tension, and a sense of isolation. Commanders confronted unprecedented challenges: how to hold positions in the city while the flanks collapsed and the Sixth Army's very existence came under threat. The first days of Operation Uranus set the stage for a military drama of unparalleled intensity. The encirclement of Stalingrad, long a strategic objective for the Soviets, began to take shape with shocking speed. German forces, previously confident in their tactical superiority and operational momentum, now faced the terrifying prospect of being trapped in a hostile city, cut off from reinforcements and resupply. The operational balance of Case Blue had shifted, and the Wehrmacht would soon confront one of the most severe challenges in its history, a battle not only for territory, but for survival within the frozen urban heart of Stalingrad. As November 1942 progressed, Operation Uranus gathered unstoppable momentum. The Soviet pincers advancing from the north and south closed with precision and speed that caught the Germans and their Axis allies by surprise. Romanian and Italian units guarding the flanks crumbled under concentrated attacks, and German reinforcements struggled to respond due to overextended supply lines and logistical bottlenecks. Within days, the encirclement of Stalingrad was no longer a theoretical threat. It had become an operational reality. The Sixth Army, firmly entrenched in the city's industrial and residential sectors, now faced the terrifying prospect of being cut off from reinforcements, supplies, and retreat. The Soviet strategy behind Operation Uranus demonstrated extraordinary operational foresight. By concentrating forces against the weaker Allied flanks, rather than the heavily fortified German positions inside Stalingrad, the Red Army exploited both material and psychological vulnerabilities. Mechanized units penetrated deep into the steppe, bypassing heavily defended areas to link up behind the Sixth Army. Artillery and infantry support followed relentlessly, creating pockets of resistance that German countermeasures could not easily overcome. The precision and coordination of the offensive reflected the maturation of Soviet operational planning, which now emphasized mobility, timing, and the integration of multiple service branches in large-scale maneuvers. For German units outside Stalingrad, the speed of Soviet breakthroughs created chaos and panic. Columns of retreating Romanian and Italian troops were cut down by Soviet tanks and artillery, and attempts to stabilize the front were largely ineffective. Roads became congested with fleeing soldiers, abandoned equipment, and burning vehicles, further complicating any German efforts at counterattack or reinforcement. Commanders struggled to assess the situation accurately, hampered by disrupted communications and the relentless pressure of advancing Soviet forces. Within days, the gap between the Sixth Army and Stalingrad and the German lines beyond the flanks had widened dangerously. Inside Stalingrad, the Sixth Army remained focused on urban combat, largely unaware of the full extent of the encirclement. Infantry continued to clear factories, residential blocks, and industrial complexes, engaging in brutal close-quarter combat with Soviet defenders. Tanks, artillery, and engineers were pushed to their limits as units sought to maintain momentum and secure key positions. The disconnect between the city's internal fighting and the collapse of the flanks would soon have catastrophic consequences. The Sixth Army was effectively trapped in a city that had become a giant death trap, surrounded by forces capable of sealing their fate. The human experience of this encirclement was staggering. German soldiers, cut off from the broader operational structure, faced dwindling supplies of food, ammunition, and medical aid. The onset of winter compounded suffering. Freezing temperatures, snow, and ice added to the physical strain and heightened the risk of frostbite and exposure. Civilians trapped in the city endured similar hardships, creating additional logistical and moral dilemmas for German commanders. Morale, though initially maintained through propaganda and discipline, began to fray under the crushing weight of isolation and attrition. German commanders recognized the gravity of the situation. Hitler, refusing to allow retreat, ordered the Sixth Army to hold its ground at all costs. Supply by air was planned, yet Luftwaffe aircraft faced Soviet resistance, limited capacity, and the difficulties of winter flying. German generals were forced into a precarious balancing act: maintain positions within the city while attempting to coordinate supplies, anticipate Soviet maneuvers, and sustain combat effectiveness under encirclement. The scale of the operational challenge was immense, and any miscalculation could be fatal. Soviet forces capitalized on every weakness, tightening the noose around Stalingrad with methodical precision. Tank formations, infantry units, and artillery converged on key junctions to prevent German breakout attempts. Mines and ambushes slowed any attempts at reinforcement, while air superiority allowed Soviet forces to harass retreating and resupplying German units. The encirclement created a psychological trap as well. Isolated units within Stalingrad understood that their operational freedom was rapidly disappearing, yet the orders from above forbade withdrawal. The city had become a prison, where every street and building could both protect and endanger the soldiers inside. By late November, the encirclement was effectively complete. German forces within Stalingrad were trapped, surrounded by Soviet pincers advancing from multiple directions. The Sixth Army, once the spearhead of the southern campaign in Caucasus, had become a victim of operational overreach, logistical miscalculations, and the extraordinary strategic planning of the Red Army. The encirclement set the stage for one of the most dramatic and devastating chapters in military history, as the Wehrmacht confronted the dual challenges of urban combat and strategic isolation. Operation Uranus not only altered the operational landscape of the Eastern Front, but also shifted the psychological and strategic momentum of the entire campaign. The Germans, long seen as invincible in maneuver warfare, now faced a reality where increment, attrition, and Soviet resilience could determine the outcome of their operations. The stage was set for the coming months of desperate defense, airlift efforts, and a struggle for survival within the frozen, shattered city of Stalingrad, a city that had transformed from a strategic objective into a crucible of history itself. Chapter 13: Stalingrad Encircled, Survival, Supply, and Strategic Dilemmas. By early December 1942, the reality of encirclement in Stalingrad had fully crystallized for the German Sixth Army. Operation Uranus had achieved what had seemed impossible just weeks prior. Army Group B's forward elements, once poised to dominate the city, were now trapped within its ruined streets, industrial complexes, and residential blocks. The surrounding Soviet pincers advancing from the north and south had sealed the perimeter, cutting off all reliable land-based supply lines. The strategic calculus of the Wehrmacht shifted dramatically. What had been a campaign of territorial gain and strategic dominance had become a desperate struggle for survival. The encirclement posed immediate logistical challenges. The Sixth Army had been accustomed to receiving supplies via secure land routes, allowing for a steady stream of food, ammunition, fuel, and medical supplies. With these routes severed, commanders were forced to rely on aerial resupply, a method fraught with danger, uncertainty, and limitations. The Luftwaffe, tasked with delivering critical supplies via transport aircraft, faced Soviet anti-aircraft fire, limited numbers of operational aircraft, and treacherous winter weather. Snow, ice, and freezing winds rendered flight operations hazardous, while the sheer volume of material required by tens of thousands of encircled troops far exceeded the Luftwaffe's capacity. Supplies arrived in fragments, forcing rationing and improvisation and leaving many units undersupplied and vulnerable. Within Stalingrad, the human toll was immediate and severe. Soldiers faced freezing temperatures, hunger, and exhaustion while continuing to fight in the dense urban terrain. Urban combat had already exacted a heavy toll over previous months, with each building, street, and factory becoming a contested zone. Now, with the Sixth Army isolated, the pressure intensified. Medical supplies were limited and field hospitals struggled to cope with the wounded. Units improvised by scavenging destroyed equipment, sharing ammunition, and using damaged buildings for shelter. Soldiers' diaries and letters reflect the grim reality. A sense of entrapment combined with the relentless physical and psychological strain of combat created a constant undercurrent of fear and desperation. German commanders faced difficult strategic dilemmas. Hitler had decreed that the Sixth Army must hold its positions at all costs, rejecting proposals for withdrawal or tactical repositioning. This order, though intended to maintain morale and preserve strategic objectives, placed commanders in an impossible position. They had to defend critical sectors of the city, continue offensive operations to secure key areas, and simultaneously manage the logistical nightmare of encirclement. Decisions regarding the allocation of limited supplies, rotation of exhausted units, and coordination of defensive lines became matters of life and death. Every choice carried profound operational and human consequences. The Soviets, aware of the Weremich's precarious situation, intensified pressure from all directions. Artillery and mortar fire pounded German positions continuously, while infantry units probed weak points in the defensive perimeter. Small, highly mobile Soviet detachments conducted raids on isolated outposts, supply points, and communications hubs. Mines, improvised explosive devices, and ambushes further disrupted German movements, forcing units to advance cautiously even within supposedly secured zones. The Soviet strategy emphasized not merely attrition, but the careful tightening of the noose around Stalingrad, isolating units and creating pockets of vulnerability that could be exploited systematically. Winter conditions exacerbated the challenges. The city, already devastated by months of bombardment, offered limited shelter against the harsh cold. Soldiers faced snow, ice, and sub-zero temperatures, often with inadequate clothing and heating supplies. Frostbite, exposure, and illness became as formidable enemies as Soviet bullets and artillery. Maintaining troop morale under these conditions required constant effort by commanders, who relied on rotation of units, strict discipline, and psychological encouragement. Even so, the strain was visible in both the physical state of soldiers and their mental endurance. Rationing became a critical aspect of survival. With aerial supply insufficient to meet full operational requirements, commanders prioritized food, ammunition, and fuel for the most critical sectors. Infantry units, particularly those in isolated positions, were often forced to share limited rations or improvise. Water sources were scarce and sometimes contaminated, further straining endurance. Despite these hardships, German soldiers continued to fight tenaciously, clearing buildings, securing streets, and defending vital sectors against relentless Soviet attacks. The urban terrain magnified both the intensity and the complexity of these engagements. The Luftwaffe's role, while critical, was constrained by operational realities. Transport aircraft delivered supplies sporadically, often under intense anti-aircraft fire or poor weather conditions. Airlift operations required careful coordination, as small errors could result in lost aircraft, missupply drops, or concentrated Soviet counterattacks. While every airdrop brought essential materials, the limitations of the method meant that units had to carefully ration and prioritize supplies. Ammunition shortages, in particular, forced commanders to make tactical decisions regarding where to commit firepower and when to hold positions. The strategic dilemmas faced by German command extended beyond logistics. With the Sixth Army trapped, there was the looming question of reinforcement and breakout. Hitler's refusal to authorize retreat complicated potential maneuvers, while the geography of the city and surrounding steppe restricted options for relief operations. Any attempt to break out of the encirclement would require coordination across devastated streets, limited armored support, and continuous pressure from Soviet artillery and infantry. German planners recognized the scale of the challenge, yet political and ideological imperatives overrode operational pragmatism. Why? Mid-December, the encircled Sixth Army was fighting a battle of endurance as much as tactics. Soldiers, exhausted and hungry, continued to hold critical sectors, while commanders grappled with logistical constraints, strategic impossibilities, and the relentless tightening of Soviet pincers. The stage was set for the coming months of desperate defense, heroic improvisation, and the eventual confrontation between human endurance and overwhelming strategic pressure. Stalingrad had become more than a battlefield. It was a crucible of survival where supply, strategy, and sheer willpower would determine the fate of thousands and the trajectory of Case Blue itself. As December 1942 deepened, the encirclement of Stalingrad by Operation Barbarossa had transformed the Sixth Army from a powerful offensive force into a beleaguered isolated garrison. The strategic implications were monumental. The MORC, previously a symbol of operational dominance on the Eastern Front, now confronted a situation where supply shortages, attrition, and psychological pressure threatened the very survival of tens of thousands of soldiers. The city itself, reduced to rubble, became both a fortress and a trap, shaping the conduct of the battle in unprecedented ways. The Luftwaffe, tasked with sustaining the Sixth Army through aerial resupply, faced immense operational difficulties. Aircraft sorties were limited by harsh winter weather, anti-aircraft fire, and the small number of operational transports capable of carrying sufficient cargo. Even when supplies were successfully delivered, distribution within the city presented further challenges. Snow-covered streets, rubble, and ongoing combat required infantry and engineers to improvise delivery methods, often moving ammunition, fuel, and food by hand or horse-drawn carts. Despite these heroic efforts, shortages were unavoidable, and commanders were forced into difficult decisions about rationing and prioritization of resources. Food scarcity quickly became a pressing concern. Rations, already minimal, were further strained by the enormous number of troops trapped within Stalingrad. Soldiers were forced to survive on drastically reduced caloric intake, sometimes relying on horse meat, rodents, or any available edible material. Malnutrition weakened combat effectiveness, slowed movement, and contributed to the spread of illness. The psychological effects of hunger compounded the stress of combat. Exhaustion, irritability, and despair became common among units. Even as discipline and determination held in key sectors, ammunition shortages were equally critical. The urban terrain demanded constant use of small arms, grenades, and artillery to clear buildings, factories, and fortified positions. Commanders were compelled to ration shells and bullets, deciding when to engage and when to hold fire to conserve resources. Tank crews faced similar dilemmas. With fuel and ammunition limited, armored units could provide only sporadic support, requiring careful coordination with infantry to maximize effectiveness. Every tactical engagement became a high-stakes calculation, where misjudgment could result in severe losses. The human toll of encirclement extended beyond combat fatigue and starvation. Winter conditions inflicted further suffering, with sub-zero temperatures causing frostbite, hypothermia, and other exposure-related illnesses. Medical supplies were limited, hospitals overcrowded, and evacuation of wounded nearly impossible. Soldiers improvised makeshift shelters in ruined buildings, sometimes creating rudimentary heating with wood from destroyed structures or scarce supplies. The harsh environment tested both physical endurance and mental resilience, forging a battle where survival was a constant concern alongside the fight against enemy forces. Soviet pressure on the encircled Sixth Army continued unabated. Artillery bombardments disrupted supply movements and defensive positions, while infantry and tank units probed weak points along the perimeter. Small unit tactics, including infiltration and raids, allowed Soviet forces to harass German positions without committing to costly frontal assaults. Mines and booby traps slowed movement, further complicating internal logistics and defensive maneuvers. Soviet planners understood that time favored them. As winter deepened and supplies dwindled, the encircled Germans would face increasing attrition. Regardless of individual bravery or tactical skill, command decisions within Stalingrad became increasingly constrained by the encirclement. Hitler's refusal to authorize withdrawal meant that local commanders had to maintain positions at all costs, balancing defensive needs with the rationing of resources. Requests for breakout operations were consistently denied, even when tactical situations suggested that localized withdrawal could preserve combat power. Communication with higher command remained challenging, further complicating decision-making. The tension between operational necessity and political directive created a strategic bind, leaving commanders to improvise solutions under pressure. Morale, though strained, remained a critical factor in sustaining the fight. Soldiers relied on discipline, camaraderie, and a sense of duty to persevere in the face of overwhelming hardship. Letters and accounts from the front describe moments of defiance, resourcefulness, and courage amidst the encirclement. Yet, the psychological strain of being cut off, witnessing comrades fall, and enduring the hardships of hunger, cold, and bombardment created an ever-present undercurrent of fear and desperation. Commanders had to continuously motivate units, rotate exhausted troops when possible, and maintain cohesion in a city that had become a vast, unforgiving battlefield. The strategic dilemma of Stalingrad extended beyond the immediate cityscape. The encirclement represented not just a tactical problem, but a critical operational challenge for Army Group B and the Wehram. If the Sixth Army were destroyed or forced to surrender, the implications for German control of southern Russia, the Caucasus oil fields, and the overall momentum of Case Blue would be catastrophic. The encirclement placed immense pressure on German high command to plan relief operations, coordinate airlifts, and maintain political control over the narrative of the campaign. Every decision carried consequences far beyond the city limits. By late December, the Sixth Army had adapted to the realities of encirclement through a combination of ingenuity, resilience, and discipline. Yet, the challenges were mounting. Supply shortages, winter conditions, Soviet pressure, and strategic isolation combined to create an environment of extreme hardship. Survival became as critical a concern as tactical victory, shaping daily operations and influencing every decision made by soldiers and commanders alike. The battle for Stalingrad, once envisioned as a straightforward conquest, had transformed into a prolonged test of endurance, strategy, and human will, a crucible that would define the fate of Case Blue and the course of the Eastern Front. Chapter 14. German Relief Efforts, Operation Winter Storm and Failed Breakouts. By early January 1943, the situation in Stalingrad had reached a critical point. The encircled Sixth Army, trapped by the Soviet pincers of Operation Uranus, was holding key industrial districts and residential sectors, but it faced dwindling supplies, bitter winter conditions, and relentless Soviet pressure. The Wehrmacht, unwilling to concede the city or abandon one of its most prestigious formations, began planning a series of relief operations. Among these, Operation Winterturm Winterwitter emerged as the centerpiece of German attempts to break the encirclement and restore a land connection to the Sixth Army. Yet the operation would soon reveal the limits of German strategic and operational capacity. Under such extreme circumstances, Operation Winterturm was conceived under the belief that a concentrated armored thrust from the southwest, led by Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, could punch through Soviet lines and establish a corridor to Stalingrad. The plan involved rapid mechanized advances across the steppe with heavy reliance on panzer divisions, supported by infantry, artillery, and Luftwaffe air cover. The goal was not merely tactical relief, but the restoration of operational flexibility, enabling the Sixth Army to resupply, reinforce, or potentially withdraw if necessary. German High Command emphasized speed and coordination, recognizing that the Soviets had concentrated forces around Stalingrad. and that any delay could doom the operation. The operational context, however, was already challenging. Soviet forces, well aware of the German reliance on the steppe for relief efforts, had fortified key positions and deployed reserves capable of responding rapidly to breakthrough attempts. Harsh winter conditions compounded the difficulties. Deep snow, sub-zero temperatures, and ice-laden roads slowed mechanized columns, reduced mobility, and increased wear on vehicles. Logistics already strained by extended supply lines and the need to maintain other fronts limited the amount of fuel, ammunition, and provisions available for the relief force. From the outset, the Wehrmacht faced a series of operational and environmental constraints that would shape the outcome of Winter Storm. As the operation commenced, German armored columns advanced across the open steppe with initial success. Panzer divisions engaged Soviet forward positions, while mobile infantry units attempted to clear flanking defenses. Artillery barges softened enemy lines and Luwa faces sought to disrupt Soviet reinforcements and supply movements. The first days of Winter Storm demonstrated both the prowess of German mechanized forces and the difficulty of coordinating such a large-scale operation under adverse conditions. Every kilometer gained required careful planning, continuous reconnaissance, and the constant adaptation to changing Soviet defensive measures. The human dimension of the operation was profound. Soldiers endured bitter cold, inadequate winter clothing, and exhaustion from continuous movement and combat. The mechanized spearheads, though fast-moving, required constant support from engineers, supply units, and artillery. Communication lines were stretched across hundreds of kilometers, vulnerable to Soviet interdiction, and the breakdowns caused by the harsh terrain. Field reports describe the strain of long marches through deep snow, the mechanical failures of tanks and trucks, and the relentless pressure of engaging well-prepared Soviet positions. Under adverse weather conditions, the physical and psychological endurance of the relief force was tested to the limits. Despite the initial momentum, the operation quickly encountered stiff resistance. Soviet commanders, aware of the strategic importance of preventing a German breakthrough, deployed reserves and armored units to critical sectors. Mines, anti-tank obstacles, and ambushes slowed German advances, while artillery and air attacks inflicted significant casualties. The open terrain of the steppe, while suitable for mechanized maneuvers, also exposed German columns to concentrated fire. Any miscalculation, overextension, misaligned units, or delay in coordination resulted in losses that could not be easily replaced. The Soviets had learned from earlier encounters, applying operational foresight to counter German initiatives. Communication and coordination within the German relief force proved increasingly problematic. Units advancing along multiple axes had to maintain synchronization to prevent isolated attacks, and to support the armored spearheads. Delays caused by terrain, enemy action, or mechanical failure disrupted the operational rhythm, forcing commanders to adjust plans on the fly. Reconnaissance was limited by winter visibility and enemy interdiction, complicating situational awareness. The cumulative effect of these challenges slowed the advance and reduced the likelihood of a decisive breakthrough capable of reaching the encircled Sixth Army. Back in Stalingrad, the encircled Sixth Army awaited relief with a mixture of hope and growing anxiety. Soldiers and commanders were aware that time was critical. Supplies were limited, winter was worsening, and Soviet forces continued to apply pressure from all sides. Yet, communication with Manstein's relief force was intermittent at best, hampered by disrupted lines and Soviet artillery. The psychological impact was profound. Troops clung to the possibility of rescue, while also confronting the sobering reality that relief might not arrive in time to prevent catastrophe. The interplay of hope, desperation, and survival instincts defined the human experience within the encirclement. Winter Storm pressed on. The limitations of German operational capacity became increasingly evident. Soviet forces coordinated, entrenched, and reinforced, absorbed German thrusts, while applying local counterattacks to disrupt momentum. Mechanical failures, Logistical shortages and harsh terrain compounded the challenges faced by Manstein's units. Each kilometer of advance required disproportionate effort and sacrifice, and the prospect of linking with the Sixth Army became ever more tenuous. The operation, initially conceived as a rapid rescue, was evolving into a grueling struggle against time, weather, and a resilient enemy. The early stages of Operation Winter Storm illustrate the complex interplay of strategy, logistics, and human endurance in one of history's most dramatic military campaigns. The Wehrmacht, once confident in its operational superiority, confronted the limitations imposed by encirclement, winter, and a determined adversary. The Sixth Army remained trapped within Stalingrad, and every day of delay increased the risk of disaster. The battle for relief had begun, and the coming weeks would test the limits of German resolve, Soviet planning, and the endurance of soldiers caught between strategic imperatives and the harsh realities of war. As January 1943 advanced, Operation Winter Storm pressed deeper into the frozen steppes surrounding Stalingrad. Yet, the challenges facing the German relief force became increasingly insurmountable. Manstein's armored spearheads, initially moving with determination and momentum, began to encounter coordinated Soviet defenses that slowed their progress to a crawl. Mines, anti-tank ditches, fortified positions, and relentless artillery fire created a formidable barrier. The farther German units advanced, the more they realized that the Soviets had anticipated the relief attempt and prepared to absorb and counter it. Every kilometer gained demanded an extraordinary expenditure of men, vehicles, and munitions, testing both strategic planning and human endurance. The Soviet response demonstrated operational sophistication. Reserves were shifted to threatened sectors, while mechanized formations conducted counterattacks to disrupt German lines of advance. Artillery units positioned with meticulous foresight targeted German supply routes, tank columns, and infantry concentrations. Anti-tank teams were strategically deployed to cover likely avenues of approach, creating choke points where German armor was vulnerable. Infantry and cavalry units executed raids against flanks and rear positions, compounding confusion and slowing the advance. The Soviets had transformed the steppe into a deadly terrain where mobility, coordination, and surprise were decisively on their side. German logistics remained a crippling challenge. Deep snow and icy conditions reduced the speed of mechanized columns, while trucks and tanks frequently broke down or became immobilized. Fuel shortages, already a recurring issue, threatened to stall operations entirely. Ammunition intended to sustain the offensive had to be carefully rationed, forcing commanders to make painful decisions about where to commit firepower. Repair crews worked under constant threat of artillery and small arms fire, struggling to maintain operational mobility. The harsh winter magnified every vulnerability. The environment became as much an enemy as the Soviet forces. The human element of Winter Storm was equally dramatic. Soldiers marched and fought in bitter cold, often with inadequate winter clothing, limited food, and minimal rest. Casualties from combat were compounded by frostbite, exposure, and exhaustion. Diaries and letters from the front revealed the relentless psychological strain. Troops aware that every delay could doom the Sixth Army, aware that failure meant annihilation, yet committed to a mission with little margin for error. Officers had to maintain discipline, motivate exhausted units, and coordinate complex maneuvers while under constant threat. The pace and intensity of operations pushed the limits of human endurance. Within Stalingrad, the Sixth Army awaited relief with a mixture of hope and apprehension. Reports of Winter Storm's progress filtered through intermittently, often contradictory and incomplete. Soldiers rationed food, ammunition, and fuel, preparing for the possibility that no rescue might arrive. The Luftwaffe continued limited supply drops, but the capacity was insufficient to sustain full combat operations. Engineers improvised shelters, redistributed resources, and repaired damaged positions, but every day of isolation increased the strain on personnel and equipment. Morale, while bolstered by discipline and hope, was constantly tested by the cold, hunger, and relentless Soviet pressure. As the relief effort progressed, the operational limits of Winter Storm became increasingly evident. Soviet forces executed tactical counterattacks that disrupted cohesion, while terrain, weather, and mechanical failures slowed German advances. Despite initial gains, the distance to Stalingrad remained formidable, and the encircled Sixth Army situation grew ever more critical. Commanders faced the agonizing realization that even partial success might not prevent disaster, and that time was running out as winter tightened its grip on the city and its defenders. Attempts at breakout within Stalingrad were considered, but fraught with risk. German commanders explored coordinated attacks from inside the city to link up with approaching relief forces. Yet limited mobility, ammunition shortages, and Soviet defensive depth made these operations extraordinarily dangerous. Every plan carried high risk, with the potential for catastrophic losses if coordination failed, or the enemy anticipated the maneuver. The Sixth Army, while disciplined and determined, was stretched to its limits, with every soldier acutely aware that failure could mean annihilation. The interplay of strategic, operational, and human factors defined the unfolding drama of Winter Storm. The Wehrmacht, despite tactical skill and armored prowess, confronted the harsh realities of attrition warfare, environmental obstacles, and a determined adversary. Soviet planning, combined with operational foresight, logistical preparation, and terrain exploitation, neutralized many advantages that German forces had previously enjoyed. Each hour of delay, each lost vehicle, and each failed maneuver compounded the peril for the Sixth Army. Mid-January, it became clear that Winter Storm would not achieve its intended goal of fully relieving the encircled army. Advances were slowed or halted, casualties mounted, and the gap between the relief force and the Sixth Army remained perilous. The failure to break the encirclement in time transformed Stalingrad into a prolonged siege, forcing German commanders to confront the full consequences of operational overreach, logistical strain, and the resilience of the Red Army. The city, once envisioned as a symbolic prize and operational objective, had become a crucible where survival, strategy, and human endurance would be tested to their absolute limits. Chapter 15: Stalingrad's Collapse, Surrender and Strategic Consequences. By late January 1943, the encircled Sixth Army in Stalingrad had endured weeks of relentless siege conditions. Operation Uranus had successfully trapped tens of thousands of German troops, while Operation Wintertorm had failed to break through Soviet defenses, leaving the army isolated, undersupplied, and facing the full weight of winter. The once proud Wehrmacht, which had advanced with confidence during Case Blue, was now a force defined by endurance, desperation, and the looming threat of annihilation. Within the shattered city, commanders and soldiers confronted the reality that time, weather, and Soviet strategic foresight had conspired to place them in a near impossible situation. The human suffering inside Stalingrad reached a harrowing intensity. Food, fuel, and ammunition were critically scarce. Soldiers rationed what little they had, sometimes surviving on scraps of horse meat, bread, or potatoes. Water sources were contaminated or frozen, and medical supplies were insufficient to treat the wounded or the sick. Frostbite and hypothermia afflicted countless men, while disease spread rapidly through overcrowded shelters and hospitals. Morale, while bolstered by discipline and the stubborn will to survive, began to erode under the relentless pressures of hunger, cold, and the psychological strain of encirclement that Hitler's orders exacerbated the crisis. Despite the dire circumstances, he insisted that the Sixth Army hold its ground at all costs, forbidding any attempt at breakout or retreat. Field Marshal Friedrich Pace, commanding the Sixth Army, faced an impossible dilemma: obey directives from above and risk total destruction, or defy orders to preserve his forces. The strategic calculus left little room for maneuver. Every sector of the city had to be defended. Supplies had to be meticulously rationed, and every decision carried the weight of life or death for thousands of men. The soldiers on the front lines were acutely aware that their survival depended as much on endurance and improvisation as on combat skill. Soviet forces in turn maintained relentless pressure on the encircled German units. Artillery barges, infantry attacks, and armored probes continually tested defensive positions. Urban terrain magnified the intensity of these engagements. Every street, factory, and building became a potential killing zone. Soviet snipers, mines, and improvised explosives inflicted further casualties, making even small movements hazardous. The encirclement had effectively transformed Stalingrad into a giant battlefield prison, where withdrawal was impossible and each engagement drained both manpower and morale. The Luftwaffe's efforts to sustain the Sixth Army by air proved insufficient. Despite the bravery of pilots and the ingenuity of supply operations, aircraft could deliver only a fraction of the necessary rations, fuel, and ammunition. Soviet anti-aircraft fire, poor weather, and logistical bottlenecks limited the effectiveness of the airlift. Soldiers relied on airdrops that were often scattered or destroyed upon impact, forcing improvisation in distribution and consumption. The insufficiency of aerial supply underscored the strategic vulnerability of an army trapped in hostile territory and highlighted the limits of German operational planning. As January turned into February, the conditions for the Sixth Army grew increasingly desperate. Soldiers faced near-constant artillery fire, the gnawing effects of starvation and freezing temperatures that immobilized men and machinery alike. Ammunition shortages forced tactical conservatism, while fuel scarcity grounded much of the remaining armored support. The city once envisioned as a decisive objective in case blue had become a frozen tomb of rubble and hardship where every street battle carried disproportionate consequences. Even elite units trained for rapid maneuver and mechanized warfare were reduced to fighting for survival with dwindling resources. Psychological stress compounded the physical hardships. Soldiers and commanders alike confronted the fear of annihilation, the strain of witnessing comrades die, and the knowledge that no land-based relief would arrive in time. Letters and diaries reflect the inner turmoil of officers and men, resolute determination mixed with despair, courage interlaced with fear. Commanders struggled to maintain cohesion, motivate units, and preserve discipline as winter tightened its grip, and the Soviet encirclement became ever more suffocating. The Soviet strategy, emphasizing attrition, encirclement, and the careful tightening of the siege demonstrated remarkable operational foresight. Rather than launching a single climactic assault, the Red Army methodically pressured the Sixth Army, exploiting supply shortages, weather conditions, and psychological strain. Urban combat combined with the surrounding steppe created a dual-layered trap. The Sixth Army could neither escape nor be resupplied effectively. Each day of resistance drained strength and resources, setting the stage for the inevitable collapse. Mid-February, the structural integrity of the Sixth Army's defensive positions began to falter. Isolated units cut off from each other were increasingly vulnerable to coordinated Soviet attacks. The combination of starvation, disease, exhaustion, and relentless enemy pressure rendered organized defense increasingly untenable. Commanders faced impossible decisions: continue holding positions that were effectively indefensible, or surrender in order to preserve the lives of their remaining troops. The enormity of the strategic and human stakes made the final outcome of Stalingrad one of the most dramatic turning points in military history. By late February 1943, the encircled Sixth Army had reached the limits of endurance. Field Marshal Friedrich Pace, recognizing the catastrophic conditions facing his troops, starvation, disease, freezing temperatures, and relentless Soviet attacks, prepared to confront the unthinkable: surrender. Hitler's earlier insistence that the army hold its ground at all costs had left the Sixth Army isolated, with no realistic prospect of reinforcement or breakout. The city that had once symbolized German ambition on the Eastern Front had become a tomb of rubble, blood, and ice, where survival depended on decisions no commander wanted to make. The surrender was not a sudden event, but a gradual unraveling of the army's capacity to resist. Units were fragmented, ammunition was almost exhausted, and fuel for armored vehicles had run out. Soldiers, many weakened by malnutrition and frostbite, were unable to maintain positions or mount effective counterattacks. Communication with higher command had all but disappeared, leaving Paulus and his staff to make the final decisions on their own. The psychological impact was profound. Officers and men faced the agonizing realization that resistance would not only be futile, but would guarantee unnecessary death. On February 2, 1943, the surrender of the Sixth Army was formally enacted. Thousands of soldiers laid down their arms, while Soviet forces meticulously processed prisoners, separating combatants from the severely wounded. The scale of the surrender was unprecedented. Approximately 91,000 German and Allied troops were captured, including Field Marshal Pace himself, who famously surrendered against Hitler's explicit orders. This event marked a decisive turning point, not only in Case Blue, but in the broader Eastern Front, as it represented the first time a full German field army had been destroyed in such a manner during World War I. The human consequences of the surrender were severe. Captured soldiers faced forced marches to prison camps, exposure to the harsh winter, and limited medical care. Many perished in the ensuing months due to malnutrition, disease, and the rigors of captivity. Yet, the psychological and symbolic impact of the surrender extended beyond the battlefield. It shattered the perception of German invincibility, emboldened Soviet forces, and shifted the strategic momentum on the Eastern Front. The fall of Stalingrad became a symbol of both Soviet resilience and the limits of German operational overreach. From a strategic perspective, the collapse of the Sixth Army had profound implications for Case Blue. The loss of over 90,000 trained, equipped, and experienced soldiers represented a catastrophic depletion of German manpower and morale. Panzer divisions, infantry formations, and supporting units were irreparably weakened, while the psychological impact on remaining German forces reverberated across the front. The defeat forced a re-evaluation of German strategic priorities in southern Russia and the Caucasus, making further advances toward oil fields and industrial centers increasingly untenable. The implications of Stalingrad extended to Axis allies as well. Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian units, which had been responsible for guarding the flanks during Operation Uranus, had suffered heavy casualties and reputational damage. Their inability to withstand Soviet attacks highlighted both weaknesses in coordination and the perils of overextension. The collapse underscored the strategic vulnerability of the German coalition and emphasized the need for greater operational cohesion, a lesson largely learned too late. Soviet planners meanwhile achieved a dual triumph. Operationally, they had successfully encircled and destroyed a significant portion of the WOC, removing the Sixth Army from the Eastern Front's order of battle. Strategically, the victory at Stalingrad shifted momentum in favor of the Red Army, boosting morale and demonstrating the effectiveness of large-scale coordinated counter-offensives. Politically, it strengthened Stalin's position both domestically and internationally, reinforcing the narrative of Soviet resilience against a seemingly invincible enemy. The surrender also forced the German High Command to reconsider doctrine and operational planning. Over-reliance on rigid orders, overextension of forces, and underestimation of enemy capabilities had contributed directly to disaster. Lessons from Stalingrad would reverberate through subsequent campaigns, shaping decisions about force allocation, operational flexibility, and the limits of mechanized warfare under extreme environmental and tactical conditions. Yet in the immediate aftermath, the focus for Germany was defensive, stabilizing the front, preventing further encirclements, and managing the psychological and material consequences of the largest defeat in German military history. In the broader context of World War I, Stalingrad marked a profound turning point. Case Blue, initially a bold campaign designed to seize Soviet oil and secure strategic advantage in southern Russia, had ended in catastrophic failure. The Sixth Army's surrender not only deprived Germany of experienced troops, but also shifted the balance of power on the Eastern Front. Soviet forces, emboldened by their success, would now assume the initiative, moving from defensive operations to large-scale offensives that would ultimately push German forces westward toward their own borders. The collapse of Stalingrad symbolized the intersection of strategy, human endurance, and operational reality. The German army, once confident in rapid advances and mechanized dominance, had been undone by overextension, harsh winter conditions, and a resilient adversary. Soldiers endured unimaginable suffering, commanders faced impossible choices, and the consequences extended far beyond the immediate battlefield. Stalingrad became not just a story of defeat but a pivotal moment in the broader narrative of the Eastern Front, shaping the outcome of Case Blue, the course of World War E, and the collective memory of one of history's most dramatic military engagements.